Hogwarts, The Return of Turmoil. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 426 Zorro Ghost Falcon. Professor Francis looked at the parchment confiscated from Maureen and asked expressionlessly, Dragon Whisperer, Disguise Magus, Phoenix Master, what are you three going to do? The whole class looked at Maureen and the other three with some gloating. Not many people dared to be absent from Professor Francis's class. Generally speaking, Professor Francis's death threat teaching method made everyone dare not be distracted, let alone whisper. The parchment was confiscated by Professor Francis. Maureen said anxiously, in order to verify whether the wizards with these abilities can deal with. Maureen quickly glanced at the blackboard and said, deal with Zorro Ghost Falcon. In fact, he didn't listen to the class at all. He didn't understand what Zorro Ghost Falcon was, but he couldn't care so much now. It's better to prevaricate first. Really? Professor Francis stared at Maureen coldly, then tell me, Maureen, do you plan to control the fire dragon to burn Zorro Demon Falcon to death, or do you plan to summon the phoenix to peck Zorro Demon Falcon blind? Maureen said awkwardly, it should be both, right? Next time you meet Zorro Demon Falcon, I hope you can find the fire dragon and the phoenix, and then come back to tell me how you deal with them. Professor Francis said coldly, the premise is that you can bring back every part of your body. Compared to Zorro Demon Falcon, the monsters in that place are much more terrifying. Maureen said in his heart, but he didn't dare to say it out loud. It was not a wise move to talk back to Professor Francis. I'm not other professors, Maureen. Professor Francis said simply and straightforwardly, I don't care where you won the award or which class you are a genius in. You don't have so many privileges in my class. Maureen muttered to himself, he didn't ask for any privileges. 5 points deducted from Gryffindor. The three of you go back today and write me a detailed paper about the Zorro Falcon, from its characteristics to its living habits, as well as the spells that can work on it and the spells that cannot hurt it, as well as the methods to subdue it. Professor Francis walked towards the podium without any emotion in his voice, and he took the parchment away by the way. Maureen originally wanted to ask him for it back, but after thinking about it, he decided to forget it. Professor Francis always had a cold and expressionless face, and he was not as easy to talk to as Professor Kane and Professor Flitwick. Maureen decided not to go and make himself bored. Because of talking in class, the three of them had one more homework than others, and they could only run to the library to find information to do their homework and finish their papers at night. I really don't like this. He has already assigned a paper on the difference between the Zorro Ghost Falcon and the one-horned purple eagle. Now we have to write 2 papers. Hugo pulled out 2 thick magic books from the bookshelf and threw them heavily on the table. The books made a dull sound. Madame Pants, who was not far away, glared at him fiercely. Stop talking nonsense and write honestly. Lily took out the parchment from her school bag and spread it out, and picked up the pen again. The next class is a practical class. If you don't want to be caught by him in the next class to deal with the big-eyed monster elf. The big-eyed monster elf is a small monster that bites people. Moss and mushrooms will grow where it bites. For second-year students, this little monster is very difficult to deal with. It has to be written 12 inches. It's annoying. Hugo complained. Professor Francis's papers must not be less than 12 inches. This is a rule that everyone is familiar with. Even if it is a little less, it will be rejected by Professor Francis and rewritten, which means that they have to write 2 12-inch papers. Maureen took out another piece of parchment and drew the 12 patterns again. He didn't have the courage to ask for the one that was confiscated. Have you heard of the 2 magic families of Cuthbert and Ambrosius? Maureen wrote down the names of the 12 families while drawing the patterns. No, are these 2 wizard families important? Ah. Even this crappy book is against me. Hugo flipped through a book guide to defense against dark magic creatures roughly, but the book he was flipping through is quite special. The book seemed to think that he was flipping too hard, so it slammed shut and pinched his hand hard. Many books in the library have magic, and some books have their own protective magic. If you scribble on a book, the book will chase you and bite you, and even spray the ink on your face. It's very important, just like the 4 families of Gryffindor, Slytherin, Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. Maureen finished drawing his own pattern, then opened the book and began to write a paper on Zorro the Ghost Falcon. Is it so old? I don't know. I guess this kind of family inheritance has been broken long ago, Hugo said while biting the pen. Neither Hugo nor Lily had heard of these two names. Maureen decided to write a letter to ask his grandfather after finishing his homework, and to ask Professor Kane tomorrow. Maybe they have heard of it. Zorro Ghost Falcon, a flying eagle with 4 wings. The feathers of the first wing on the left can make it immune to the stunning spell, and the second wing on the right can make it immune to ice magic and fire magic. This guy is really hard to deal with. By the way, there's a basilisk in Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets, and Hufflepuff's Chamber of Secrets is the room of requirement. Where do you think the Chamber of Secrets of Gryffindor and Ravenclaw are? Will there be eagles and lions imprisoned in them? Hugo hurriedly wrote a few words on the parchment, then looked up and asked with interest. I don't know, and I'm not interested. Maureen wrote down the habits of Zorro's Ghost Falcon on the parchment. I'm more concerned about Lucas now. Don't be like that, Maureen. Let the adults deal with their own affairs, and we just need to find the treasure, Hugo said with a smile. The latest novels are first published on the 69th book bar. Hugo, you can write a letter to ask your mother. She is very knowledgeable, and she probably knows. Lily said. What to ask? Gryffindor's treasure or how to find Lucas? Are you crazy? If I ask, she will definitely send me another warning letter. Hugo pouted. He would never want to rush into the fire. Yes, it's useless to ask. Even if they know, they won't tell us. They don't like us to do dangerous things, Lily said indifferently. Maureen stared at a paragraph of text in the book. Some wizards would raise Zorro Falcons. They were very aggressive, and ordinary spells were ineffective against these ferocious animals. To deal with Zorro Falcons, you can use grass pulp made from leaves to draw triangle and circle mosaic pattern to trap them. As long as they are introduced into this pattern, they dare not fly out. Another way is to find a ghost. They are afraid of ghosts. Ghost? That's right, ghosts. Maureen suddenly said in surprise. What's wrong? What's wrong with ghosts? Lily looked at the book and said, use ghosts to deal with Zorro Falcons. No. Maureen said thoughtfully, why did I forget about this? What did you forget? Hugo asked curiously. Do you remember Helena and the Bloody Baron who disappeared at the beginning of the school year? Maureen said. Remember, they are not missing. Wait, you mean? Hugo widened his eyes. Yes, Helena must know where Ravenclaw's secret room is. Maybe the black cube is hidden in the secret room. Chapter 427 Ghost. Oh, that's not what I meant. Hufflepuff said that the black cube would not be hidden in the school because it is too dangerous. Maureen shook his head. He didn't care about the Chamber of Secrets, and he was basically sure that the black cube was not in the school, otherwise he would get lost in the castle every evening, which was not fun. Then what do you want to say? Hugo asked. I mean, Helena said last time that she was going to find an answer about the Invisible Man. She is the daughter of Ravenclaw. What if she meant to find the whereabouts of the black cube? Maureen said hesitantly. This can explain it. When the stone archway outside Hogwarts Castle suddenly appeared, Helena left the school for no reason, and asked Myrtle to tell Maureen not to go to the Forbidden Forest. I'm afraid Helena already knew that there was a black cube in the Forbidden Forest, and she should also know where the black cube guarded by her family is. Then the missing Helena should have gone to confirm the matter of the black cube. I never thought about this, Hugo said in surprise. That's because you never think about serious things, Lily said bluntly. Maureen hurriedly finished the paper on the parchment, and then said, anyway, I should consider looking for Helena first. She lived in the era when the stone arch was opened and closed, and she must know these hidden secrets. Then where should we go to find a ghost? This is not a simple matter. Lily held her chin. Ghosts will not leave any traces wherever they go, and ordinary magic can't find them. I remember that senior sister Magatha who was chasing you couldn't find them, right? By the way, speaking of her, this elusive guy has terrible abilities. She is a crow's mouth. If she says I have to redo my homework, I have to redo it. Crow's mouth is also a special magical ability, right? Hugo pouted. I can hear what you are saying. Magatha's voice sounded faintly behind Hugo. Hugo was startled and fell off the chair. Can you make a sound when you speak? Hugo said angrily. Zhi. Magatha stood beside a row of bookshelves with a magnifying glass, and said calmly, can I talk now? Hugo rolled his eyes. What do you want to say? If you don't cross out the description of the composition of the Zorro Falcon's nest in the second paragraph of this paper, you will definitely be asked to rewrite it by Professor Francis. Magatha said very calmly. I believe you, you are a bad idler. Hugo cursed, but his actions betrayed himself. Hugo had taken out a magic eraser to erase the ink written in the second paragraph. Magatha's predictions for Hugo were always accurate and never missed. Hugo didn't want to take risks with his homework. Magatha, have you heard of Cuthbert and Ambrose? Maureen wrote the two surnames on a piece of paper and handed it to Magatha. Magatha took out a Maureen research manual and made some notes, then shook her head. I've never heard of it. Why do you want to know these two surnames? Don't worry about this for now. Help me calculate where these two surnames can be found? Or who can I ask? Maureen asked. I can't calculate it. I need to see traces and clues. Magatha walked to the chair next to Maureen and sat down. She took a magnifying glass and looked at Maureen's ears again. She also exhaled, and Maureen got goosebumps all over his body. Then did you calculate Helena's disappearance last time when the principal asked you to calculate it? Maureen pushed Magatha's magnifying glass away. No, the difficulty of calculating ghosts is second only to you. Magatha said seriously. Hugo revised the second paragraph of his paper, and then asked with interest, by the way, can you calculate where the Ravenclaw's secret room is? Magatha glanced at Hugo. I don't calculate such illusory things. Just say you can't calculate it. Hugo muttered disappointedly. Magatha glared at Hugo fiercely. Magatha, can you do me a favor? Maureen said. Speak. Magatha nodded without hesitation. To her, Maureen's every word, action, question and movement were all things she studied. Help me find out which wizards have special abilities, such as Parseltongue, Phoenix Master, Dragon Whisperer, Healing Magus, Disguise Magus, and the like. Those wizards who are born with special abilities. Oh yes, your arithmancy is also one of them. Maureen said. Magatha quickly wrote down Maureen's words, then closed the research manual and said solemnly, no problem. It is my responsibility to study you. The latest novels are first published on the 6th-9th book bar. She stood up and left proudly. She agreed so readily. Hugo said with a smirk, you can see that she is sincere to you. You think too much? In her eyes, I am just a test subject for the research topic of arithmetic divination magic. Maureen shrugged his shoulders and continued to write his thesis. In order to find out the abilities of the descendants of Ravenclaw and Gryffindor, Maureen specifically asked Professor Kane and Professor Flitwick, and mentioned the two surnames of Cuthbert and Ambrosius. Why are you asking this? Professor Kane usually answered Maureen's questions, but now he habitually asked Maureen a most basic question before answering. You don't want to do anything uneasy, do you? You don't want to find the inheritance of Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. No, I'm not interested in that. Maureen promised solemnly. I know you students are saying that the stone arch is the inheritance of the 4 founders of Hogwarts or something like that, but you are an excellent student. Don't pay attention to such fictitious things. Also, don't do anything dangerous. I haven't talked to you about the last centaur incident. Do you want me to write a letter to tell your grandfather? Or go to Professor Sinistra to see the meteor shower? Maureen said sincerely, Professor, I just have a strong interest in the history of Hogwarts. You know, there is an exam for history of magic. How can a well-behaved and excellent student like me fail history of magic? I have to think about everything you say now. Professor Kane said leisurely, you are too good at making trouble. You run wherever there is danger. Maureen sighed. Professor Kane was good to him, but because Maureen was always making trouble, Professor Kane would always be careful now to guard against Maureen causing trouble. But then again, I seem to have heard of this name somewhere. Professor Kane stroked his chin. This Ambrose seems familiar. Chapter 428 Mag's Summary. Who is it? Professor? Maureen asked hurriedly. I don't remember it very clearly, Ambrose. I remember someone with this last name, maybe in a book. Is this important? Professor Kane asked doubtfully. Yes, very important. The 12 families, Professor, about the Room of Requirement. Hufflepuff once mentioned these 12 families. Maureen originally wanted to hide it, but later he felt that it would be more reliable to ask Professor Kane for help in such matters, as it was too tiring to grope around alone. He quickly told Professor Kane what happened in the Room of Requirement. You said the Room of Requirement was... Wait, why didn't I know that the Room of Requirement was left by Hufflepuff? Professor Kane didn't seem to believe it. Maureen lifted the strap of her school bag and said, Professor, it is said that no one believed whether Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets existed in the past. I heard from Hugo that even Headmaster McGonagall didn't believe it at the time. Maybe it requires some opportunity. You know, this kind of thing is really hard to believe, isn't it? Then why did Hufflepuff come to you? Professor Kane looked at Maureen. You are from our Gryffindor. Why would Hufflepuff come to you? Shouldn't she be looking for Hufflepuff students? Are you really looking for the inherited treasure of the 4 founders? Maureen touched her nose. No, I'm not interested in the treasure. She came to me just because I happen to have this need. Professor Kane touched his chin and looked at Maureen from head to toe suspiciously, then waved at him. Then I'll go and take a look. I do know where the room of requirement is. By the way, I've used it to play billiard before. Billiard? Oh, it's a Muggle game. You probably don't know it. I was playing billiards while listening to classical music. The room of requirement played with me. You can try it. I didn't know you had such a taste. Maureen muttered. Professor Kane and Maureen turned up the stairs together, and then walked towards the empty classroom on the 7th floor. They turned a corner and stopped in front of the room of requirement. So what did you think at the time? Professor Kane asked. Take this pattern and think about what the 12 patterns represent. Maureen handed the parchment to Professor Kane. But it may not be useful, Professor. I can't go there again after I've been there once. Is that so? Professor Kane looked at the 12 patterns, and then concentrated on thinking about the meaning of the 12 patterns in his mind. 5 minutes passed, and nothing appeared. Why do I feel a little silly? Professor Kane raised his eyebrows. Professor, although you may think that I often make trouble, many times I have been proved to be right. Maureen said helplessly, you can trust me. Then I'll go ask Headmistress McGonagall. The school has never recorded that the room of requirement was left by Hufflepuff. Professor, don't. Maureen said hurriedly, I really don't want to go to the principal's office for tea anymore. Headmistress McGonagall, her tea is too hot. You see, we are so familiar with each other, aren't we? You can go and ask Headmistress McGonagall, but can you please not say that I did it? When will you be afraid of the tea brewed by the principal? The tea in the principal's office is not something that everyone can drink. Should I feel honored? You should be ashamed, Maureen. Professor Kane glared at Maureen, stuffed Maureen's parchment into his pocket, and said, stop talking nonsense. You do this and that all day long. If something goes wrong, I will have to take the blame. Don't mess around anymore. I'll take this paper first. You should behave yourself and don't make trouble. Maureen opened his mouth. Professor, I just drew this. It's very difficult to draw these patterns. But Professor Kane ignored him and said, anyway, I will help you keep an eye out. I must have heard of these 2 names. You read your book carefully, and I will check. There's indeed something wrong with Lucas. Professor Kane left with Maureen's parchment. Professor, let me make a duplicate of the parchment. Maureen shouted from behind. But Professor Kane had already walked away. He sighed and was about to draw a new one. Magatha was very quick. In order to study the secret of Maureen's Mercury retrograde, she took Maureen's needs as a top priority. So in just 3 days, she had already stuffed a thick notebook into Maureen's hands. This contains all the special ability wizard information I can find. Tell me, what magic abilities do you want to know? Magatha crossed her arms and looked at Maureen in confusion. Awesome! Maureen couldn't help but exclaimed. Although Magatha followed him all day, it was a bit annoying, but she was really efficient. Maureen couldn't wait to open the notebook, and then he saw a series of strange magical abilities, including being able to talk to slugs, being able to talk to hippogriffs, being able to talk to maggots. Magatha classified 273 types of wizards with special language abilities. The latest novels are first published on 69 Shuba. Maggots? Are you serious? Maureen muttered. This is really a very strange ability. More than 30 years ago, there was a record of such a wizard who did have this ability, whether it was a dragon speaker, a phoenix speaker, or a serpent speaker. These people were collectively called animal speaker magus, who were born with a magical ability to communicate with certain animals, which other wizards could not learn. Magatha explained. Maureen wondered if he was a beastly magus. You know, he could understand what Doi said all day long, such as Momo, stupid, Doi, awesome, which made Doi very proud. He didn't know what species Doi belonged to. What is the ability of this Obscurus? Maureen asked curiously. It is an evil magical ability. The wizard children with magic will suppress their magical abilities because there is no one to guide them, and a dark parasite will be derived. This magical ability is relatively rare and generally can't survive for long. It seems that only one child who was parasitized was over 10 years old in history. Magatha reached out and pulled out a strand of Maureen's hair. "Ah, what are you doing?" Maureen cried out in pain. "I'll help you look up information, you have to give me a strand of hair to study." Magatha thought this was natural, and she was already observing Maureen's hair with a magnifying glass. "Really, at least remind me," Maureen muttered, touching his head. "This obscurus must be ruled out. The special abilities of the 12 family descendants must not be this, otherwise it will be a problem for the descendants to grow up. Transfiguration Magus should also be considered. Healing Magus must be one of them. And Ran should be a very special healing Magus, but her ability has not been fully demonstrated. Maybe I have to find a very special Transfiguration Magus, Maureen said to himself. If you are looking for a more special Transfiguration Magus, then by the way, Grindelwald is a very powerful Transfiguration Magus. He is more powerful than ordinary Transfiguration Magus. He can become anyone in an instant. It is a complete transformation, from hair to clothes. It is unlikely that other Transfiguration Magus want to directly become a certain person. At most, they can change their appearance freely, but they can't completely become a specific person. Magatha said without raising her head. Grindelwald? This person? Maureen pondered for a moment, because Grindelwald's reputation was no less than that of Voldemort, but Maureen was not sure whether he had any relationship with the 12 families. In any case, he still marked it. Chapter 429 Special Magus. Magatha sorted out a lot of wizards with special abilities, most of which Maureen had never heard of before. There's even a sense magus. Maureen found it very fresh. In Magatha's notes, a sense magus refers to a wizard with very sharp senses, such as a wizard with strong eyesight and a natural telescope function, a sharp hearing that can eavesdrop on sounds 1 kilometer away and sounds of various different bands, an extraordinary sense of smell that can be used to track any smell within 5 kilometers, a special speaking voice that can imitate anyone's tone. Although ordinary wizards can also use magic items to achieve these abilities, those who are born with them still have an advantage. Why is there no record of animagus? Maureen asked. Animagus is something that can be learned later in life, not innate, and is more common. I wrote it on the last page. Magatha said. Maureen nodded slightly, and he saw another special magus, called curse-free magus, which Maureen had never heard of before. Some wizards are naturally immune to certain spells. For example, stunning spell is ineffective against them, and petrification spell, fire spell and the like. Curse-immune magus can resist a certain special spell, but there are too few such people. In the past 30 years, there are only 2 such people recorded in magic data. One can avoid being petrified, and the other does not have to worry about being knocked unconscious by stunning spell. Magatha said here, suddenly paused, frowned, and looked at Maureen. Wait, you are not also curse-immune magus? Doesn't this explain why you can't be divined? Oh. God, I didn't think of this before. Really? Am I also curse-immune magus? Maureen shrugged his shoulders. He didn't know that, but it was true that he was naturally resistant to legilimency spells. Except for legilimency masters like Hufflepuff who were naturally unstoppable, other people couldn't even see his memories. Even old wizards like Paingard fell into Maureen's hands. As for why he couldn't be divined, he didn't know. Maureen felt that, probably like what Arnok said, he had a thick skin and the magic of divination could not penetrate it. It must be like this. I actually found a curse-free magus. It's incredible. You should be one of the unrecorded curse-free magus that cannot be divined. Magatha put Maureen's hair away and said excitedly. Great, you have figured out who I am. Will you stop following me in the future? Maureen was also very happy that Magatha thought so that he would not be blocked by a girl at the door when he went to the toilet. Then I will study you more carefully. Magatha waved her magnifying glass. Curse-free magus is almost 1 in a million. I can create a new research topic. Maybe I can publish a book called Curse-free magus that cannot be divined. Maureen Walker, the Terminator of Profit and Arithmetic Diviner. What do you think? Alpacas were galloping through Maureen's mind. Why was Magatha so happy that he was the Terminator of the arithmetic fortune teller? Magatha couldn't wait to say, I'm going to write a biography for you, so please give me some reaction. I did react. Maureen said seriously, I just rolled my eyes. Maureen took Magatha's notebook back and studied it carefully. He had never heard of many strange abilities, which greatly opened his eyes. But even with such a magus summary notebook, Maureen couldn't be sure what the special abilities of the descendants of the 12 families were. During the defense against the dark arts class on Friday, without any surprise, Maureen and the other three were called by Professor Francis to deal with the big-eyed monster elves. He caught a cage of purple bat monsters. This monster had very sharp claws and only one big eye on its face. This big eye looked innocent, but it was definitely not so easy to mess with. How to deal with this kind of thing? Hugo asked nervously. Freezing spell, just freeze their eyes, don't let the mouth on the tail bite them. Maureen whispered. He did his homework. The mouth of this monster is on the back of the tail. They will first use their pitiful big eyes to make people mistakenly think they are harmless, and then let people relax their vigilance. Then they will take the opportunity to pounce on people and bite them with their tails. Freezing spell, I understand. Hugo drew out his wand. Professor Francis waved his wand, and all the desks and chairs flew to the wall. Other students were also afraid of the Zorro Falcon, and hurriedly leaned against the wall, fearing that the Zorro Falcon would find the wrong person after being released. I hope you can study the relevant content seriously, otherwise you will lose your life, Professor Francis said. What? Will you lose your life? Hugo exclaimed. Shut up, Hugo, you know what this means. Lily shouted beside him. Professor Francis often teaches with death threats. Any dark magic creature has various ways to kill people. Hugo forgot this when he was nervous. Professor Francis had already released 3 big-eyed monsters from the cage. The 3 big-eyed monsters were slowly flying in front of them. Their weak appearance really made it hard for them to kill them. The latest novels are published on 69 Shuba. But Hugo couldn't wait to cast a freezing spell on their eyes. Gee. Why doesn't it work? Hugo shouted. His freezing spell clearly hit the eyes of the target, but the big-eyed monster suddenly pounced on him and bit Hugo's shoulder. It will close its eyes. You have to catch it by surprise. Maureen rushed to the site and avoided the big-eyed monster elf flying towards it. Then he flicked his wand and turned a piece of paper in the corner into a bee. The big-eyed monster elf saw the bee and was distracted. When it turned its head, Maureen quickly waved his wand and hit its eyeball from the side with a freezing spell. Snap! The big-eyed monster elf fell from the air. But Hugo over there was in a bad condition. He was bitten several times by the big-eyed monster elf. His whole body was covered with moss and mushrooms. Even a bright red mushroom grew on his head and nose. He looked particularly miserable. In the end, it was Maureen who helped him subdue the big-eyed monster elf. As for Lily, she solved it by herself, but her finger was also bitten. I didn't ask you to help, Maureen. Professor Francis coldly dripped a bottle of potion on Hugo, and the mushrooms and moss on Hugo's body disappeared. Please stay after class, Professor Francis said to Maureen coldly. Maureen felt helpless. Professor Francis was going to make trouble for him again. Chapter 430, Pattern of Stone Arch. After the defense against the dark arts class, other students left the classroom one after another, only Maureen walked slowly towards the podium. Professor Francis was staring at Maureen with an indifferent look on his face. Under his death gaze, Maureen didn't even have the courage to run away. Professor, what can I do for you? Maureen asked depressedly. Professor Francis made a death nasal sound indifferently. In the past, anyone who was favored by this nasal sound would basically be put in solitary confinement. But Professor Francis just pulled out a piece of parchment from under the thick magic book, spread it flat on the desk, and asked, Why do you know these 12 patterns? Maureen took a look and found that it was the parchment that Professor Francis had confiscated a few days ago. For this reason, he specially drew a new one, and then it was confiscated by Professor Kane again. So far, he has drawn it 3 times. Professor, I told you last time that I saw it on the Dumbledore cup. Maureen felt a little strange and didn't understand why Professor Francis asked this question, because after returning from the Dumbledore cup, Maureen went to the principal's office and told the principal about the 12 patterns. He also asked Professor Kane about the meaning of the 12 patterns every day. Professor Francis was also present at the time. That's just your one-sided statement. Professor Francis said in a hard tone, You'd better explain the whole story. Why did no one see these 12 patterns, but only you saw them? To be honest, Professor, I also want to know this question. Maureen said innocently. Professor Francis looked Maureen up and down coldly, and the death gaze without any emotion was even worse than the dead skeletons he met in the cemetery. Maureen was confused. When he came back in November last year, Professor Francis didn't ask him this question. Why is he suddenly interested in this now? Professor, I don't understand. You will understand. Professor Francis waved his wand, and all the books on his desk automatically flew up and were arranged. The parchment also floated into his hands, and then he threw his long wizard robe and walked out of the classroom. Maureen was just rejoicing that he had escaped a disaster, but Professor Francis had already turned back and looked at him coldly. This look that made anyone who glared at him have an abortion extinguished Maureen's fluke mentality at once. He knew that he should follow Professor Francis obediently. Professor Francis walked out of the classroom, and Maureen followed his footsteps depressedly. As soon as he walked out of the classroom, Hugo was waiting for him outside the classroom to have lunch together, but Professor Francis glanced at Hugo, and Hugo turned around and ran as if he was facing a great enemy. The turning movement was done in one go, and the steps were vigorous and powerful. It was the instinct of a mouse seeing a cat. Maureen, be healthy, have good luck, see you again if you have the chance, bye. Hugo disappeared quickly at the stairs. He was completely frightened by Professor Francis. Maureen muttered. Professor Francis was really a bad star among all teachers. Everyone was afraid of him. In the past, all students would stay away from Professor Francis and hold their breath wherever he walked. In Professor Francis's philosophy, even a sneeze could be a deadly black magic, so no one dared to act recklessly. Now it was time for school to end. Many students who were playing in the corridor quieted down. Seeing Maureen following Professor Francis with a sullen look on his face, they looked at Maureen with extremely sympathetic eyes, as if they were looking at a warrior going to the execution ground. James silently waved his wand to Maureen and threw a wreath. If Professor Francis had not been in front of Maureen, he might have put the wreath around Maureen's neck himself to express his most sincere condolences. Maureen wanted to ask Professor Francis where he was going, but he thought it was not wise to ask at this time, so he could only follow him down the stairs to the first floor, and then continue to walk towards the castle gate. They walked along the downhill road outside the castle, all the way to the stone arch standing on the hillside. There was a layer of protective magic outside the stone arch, and students could not get close to it, but Professor Francis waved his wand and passed through the protective magic, and then stopped in front of the stone arch. Maureen was surprised to find a group of people standing next to the stone arch, including Headmaster McGonagall, Professor Kane, Professor Flitwick, Professor Sinistra, and Professor Adams. They seemed to have been waiting for Maureen. The moment she saw Maureen, Headmaster McGonagall pursed her lips into a slit, and her serious eyes fell on Maureen, which made Maureen feel uncomfortable again. Do you want to explain to us, Maureen? Principal McGonagall's nose twitched slightly, about this stone arch. Maureen felt so tired. He felt uncomfortable every time he was surrounded by a bunch of professors. Professor, I don't know how to explain it, you already know everything. Maureen said. Then tell me, what do these patterns mean? Principal McGonagall pointed to the stone arch behind him. What pattern? Maureen asked puzzled. Professor King waved at Maureen and said, come and see the pattern on the stone arch. The latest novels are first published on the 6th 9-book bar. Maureen hesitated for a moment, walked onto the stone platform, and came to the front of the stone arch. Then he was surprised to find that there were actually patterns on both sides of the stone arch, exactly the same as the pattern he drew. Have these patterns existed before? Maureen asked puzzledly. Headmaster McGonagall and the others looked at each other, as if they were thinking about whether to respond to Maureen's question. After a moment, Headmaster McGonagall took out a piece of parchment, and Maureen noticed that this parchment was taken away from him by Professor Kane. Headmaster McGonagall said, why do you know there are a total of 12 patterns here? I've already said that I saw it on the Dumbledore cup. Zimmerman cast a certain magic on me, and they have these 12 patterns on their foreheads. Maureen emphasized it again. He suddenly felt that something was wrong, especially the expressions of Professor Kane and the others, who seemed to be thinking about something. Professor Kane was also at the scene at the time. He didn't see the so-called sandman you mentioned, nor did he see these patterns. Was it the illusion magic that Zimmerman cast on you? Headmaster McGonagall asked. I don't know, Professor, maybe it's some powerful illusion magic, but why are you suddenly interested in these patterns? You never cared about it before. We have always cared about this, Walker. Professor Francis said coldly, but we don't need to tell you everything, a second-year student. Chapter 431 The pattern that suddenly appeared. Maureen was very disgusted with what Professor Francis said. Adults always felt that children should not be involved in such things. Even if professors knew some secrets, they would not let students know. But the professors did not know that this matter had already involved Maureen. "If you don't tell me, why are you looking for me now?" Maureen asked. Professor Kane hesitated for a moment, then said, "Because the stone arch did not have these patterns at the beginning." "What does this mean?" "There were no such patterns on the stone arch before." Maureen asked puzzledly, "Then why are there suddenly now?" "You tell us the answer, Walker." Principal McGonagall shook the parchment in her hand. "Why are there 9 patterns on the stone arch out of the 12 patterns you drew?" 9 patterns. Maureen frowned. He didn't quite understand. "Aren't there 12 patterns?" Professor Kane gestured to Maureen and said, "Count carefully. There are 9 patterns on the stone arch, but you drew 12 patterns. Does that mean there will be 3 more patterns on the stone arch?" Maureen looked at the stone arch. He was no stranger to it. He had seen it in the room of requirement last time. The marks on both sides of the stone arch seemed to be printed on the stone, as if they had been engraved there for a long time, and the patterns on it added up to exactly 9. "Professor, when did these 9 patterns appear?" Maureen asked. "You don't need to worry about this," Professor Francis said. "If you don't tell me the whole story, how can I understand what you want to know?" Maureen was a little annoyed. He felt uncomfortable every time he talked to Professor Francis. "It's not a problem to tell Maureen. I think he needs to know about this," Professor Flitwick said beside him. He usually smiled, but now his face was very serious. This matter made the professors of the school treat it with caution. Professor K nodded and said, "I think so too. Although this child is a little naughty, he knows a lot of things. It is necessary to let him know." He looked at Principal McGonagall. Principal McGonagall was silent for a moment and nodded slightly. Professor Kane continued, "The stone arch appeared here in August last summer vacation. When it appeared, there were only these 4 patterns on the stone arch." Professor Kane pointed out 4 of the patterns. Maureen recognized the 4 marks. One was the pattern at the bottom of the black magic cube guarded by the centaurs, which was the mark of the Anrin family. One was the mark of the Paingird family. One was the mark of Professor Adams' family, and the other was the mark of Grindelwald. These 4 patterns appeared during the summer vacation. Maureen was surprised. "Yes, when we found the mark of the Dark Lord Grindelwald on the stone arch, we attached great importance to it. After all, this mark should not appear casually in our school, so we immediately protected it and invited many magic experts to study this stone arch." Professor Kane said slowly. "Grindelwald's mark is actually the mark of the Deathly Hallows. When it appeared, the teachers at Hogwarts regarded it as a mark of dark magic and did not think about the Deathly Hallows." "Why didn't you tell me about the 4 marks on the stone arch?" Maureen had never known about it before. Not only him, but other students also didn't know about it, because at the beginning of the school year, the professors isolated the stone arch with magic and didn't let students get close. If they didn't look closely, no one would notice that there were several strange marks on the stone arch. Students shouldn't come into contact with this kind of dark magic mark, Professor Francis said coldly. This statement left Maureen with no excuse to refute. "What about this?" Maureen pointed at the mark of Paingird. "Paingird has been plotting in the school last year. This is his mark. You all knew at the time that his target was me. There is no direct evidence to prove that Paingird is a dark wizard, Maureen." Professor Kane shook his head. "Paingird is considered by everyone to be a person with superb painting skills. His paintings are widely circulated in the wizarding world, and many wizards respect this painter. Although we believe what you and Professor Charles said, the people at the Ministry of Magic will not believe it. In addition, you are a problem teenager who often gets into trouble. We think it is better not to let you know about this." Maureen stood in front of the stone arch, with a helpless look on his face. He didn't know when he had been regarded as a problem teenager by the professors. At the beginning, there were only 4 marks, and we didn't care at the time, but in September, the 5th mark appeared. Professor Kane pointed to the majestic lion pattern and continued, "This pattern is our Gryffindor mark, so when it appeared, we didn't care." In October, the Slytherin mark appeared. Maureen seemed to have thought of something. "Then what?" Maureen asked impatiently. "The latest novels are first published on June 9th book bar. In December, the marks of Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff appeared. Because the 4 marks that appeared later belonged to our school, we didn't worry about this problem. But Professor, I told you about these 12 patterns in November, why didn't you connect them to this stone arch?" Maureen asked. When the Dumbledore Cup came back in November, Maureen gave these 12 patterns to Professor Kane, hoping that Professor Kane could help figure out the origins of these patterns. Professor Kane was silent for a moment, then said, "Actually, I had made the connection at that time, but considering that the matter of the stone arch is a school secret, it cannot be disclosed to students before our professors have figured it out." Especially Professor Kane looked at Maureen meaningfully. "You are always restless, and check this parchment. You have done a lot of dangerous things since you went to school. If I tell you again, who knows what kind of trouble you will make." No wonder every time Maureen asked Professor Kane about the 12 patterns, Professor Kane always evaded and said he didn't know. He was worried that Maureen would get into trouble again. "What about now? Why do you suddenly want to tell me today?" Maureen frowned. "Because last time you mentioned the 12 families of Hufflepuff, I went back to discuss this matter with Professor Francis. Professor Francis found something wrong, and there are some unexpected situations at present, so he had to find you," Professor Kane said. "What unexpected situation?" Maureen asked. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelists. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 432: The Missing Ghost. Professor Francis looked at Maureen coldly and said, "You recorded 2 surnames on the parchment, one is Professor Adams, and the other is Cuthbert." Professor Francis glanced at Professor Adams next to him, and Professor Adams smiled at Maureen a little uncomfortably. "This is also the main reason why we called you here today," Professor Francis said coldly. Professor Francis asked, "Do you know who Cuthbert is?" "Who is it?" Maureen asked subconsciously. "Cuthbert is a very old surname, and we may not even know this surname. Tell me, where did you know it from?" Professor Francis took a step closer to Maureen. He was taller than Maureen, and his whole person had always been cold, which gave Maureen a great sense of oppression. But Maureen was often invited to drink tea by the professor, and he had developed a mentality of being a dead pig that was not afraid of boiling water, so he did not have any special feelings about Professor Francis' oppression. "Have you found out this surname?" Maureen was surprised. He had been wondering who Cuthbert was, but he had no idea about this surname. "It's Professor Binns, Maureen," Professor Kane said beside him. Professor Binns was originally called Binns Cuthbert. Professor Binns is the descendant of Cuthbert. Maureen was slightly surprised. "Why didn't we know it? Not to mention that you students don't know, even we professors don't know. We have always called him Professor Binns." Principal McGonagall said, "Professor Binns has been teaching for the longest time, longer than any of us. I can tell you that all of us here were taught by him. We have all taken his History of Magic course. Professor Dumbledore once mentioned that Professor Binns had taught him before Professor Dumbledore was actually Professor Binns' student." "Oh my god." Maureen felt incredible in his heart. Professor Binns actually taught Professor Dumbledore? Professor Binns is really an old ghost. Then why do you suddenly know his surname? Maureen asked. "Because he suddenly disappeared." Principal McGonagall raised her glasses. "Missing." Maureen was stunned for a moment. "Professor Binns is missing." Principal McGonagall nodded slightly. "Professor Binns has always been the most dedicated professor. He even thought about teaching after his death. Over the years, he has never missed any class and knows more about the history of magic than anyone else. But the day before yesterday afternoon, he did not go to the 5th grade class. A student came to report this matter, and we found it strange." The other professors looked at Maureen seriously, as if Maureen had kidnapped him. "He is the professor with the least reason to miss classes, because he is a ghost and has nothing to do except teaching. We looked for him for a long time before we realized that he had left Hogwarts." Principal McGonagall continued. Maureen quickly remembered one thing. After the Dumbledore Cup ended, Maureen had asked Professor Kane what the 12 patterns were. At that time, Professor Kane mentioned that Professor Binns seemed to have seen one of the patterns, but Professor Binns did not remember it. Now it seems that Professor Binns did not forget it at all, but he did not want to say anything about the Cuthbert family. "Professor, maybe he went home to visit his descendants. You should go to his house to find him," Maureen suggested. Since Professor Binns was a descendant of Cuthbert, Maureen could infer that Professor Binns must have known that the Black Cube might be dangerous, so he wanted to check whether his descendants had protected the Black Cube. "We have thought about this problem. Ghosts usually linger in the places where they have lived. We thought maybe he wanted to see his descendants or something, so we went to investigate the matter of his descendants yesterday." Principal McGonagall paused and continued, "But unfortunately, no one knows where his descendants are. There is not even a registration record of him in the Hogwarts faculty files. After Hogwarts School suffered a severe blow more than 20 years ago, many archival materials were burned. It is normal that we can't find registration information. We only found a simple document. That document was more than 500 years old. We speculate that he is about 500 to 700 years old. It was also from that document that we learned that his original name was Binns Cuthbert, but it is not clear where his descendants are living now." Principal McGonagall set her eyes on Maureen again. "Then can you explain, Maureen, why all of us just learned yesterday that Professor Binns's last name was Cuthbert, but you wrote his name on the parchment a few days ago? In addition, why did you write down Professor Adams's last name as well?" Professor Adams said to Maureen, "I didn't know there was a pattern of our family on the stone archway here before, because I was almost a squib, so I didn't pay attention to the stone archway. It was only when Professor Francis found me that I found out. The teachers here were all teachers in the school. They all knew Professor Adams' situation, and Professor Adams didn't shy away from the fact that he was a squib. I've told Professor Kane everything I know." Maureen shook her head. "Hufflepuff built a room of requirement. She told me there were 12 families and patterns, that's it. Then tell me, you are a student of Gryffindor, why did Hufflepuff look for you?" Professor Francis glanced at Professor Sinistra, who had been silent beside him, and then continued in a cold voice, "Why not go to the headmaster or students of Hufflepuff?" Professor Sinistra's eagle-eyed eyes kept staring at Maureen. Maureen was her least favorite student because Maureen's astronomy grades were terrible. The latest novel is published on 69 Shuba. A student who excels in other subjects is like a fool in astronomy. No matter how he is taught, he can't learn it. It's as if he is deliberately going against Professor Sinistra. Professor Sinistra is the dean of Hufflepuff House. If the founder of Hufflepuff left anything, he should go to Hufflepuff students, but he went to Gryffindor's Maureen. This made Professor Sinistra even more dissatisfied. "Do you have anything to explain about Hufflepuff?" Professor Sinistra's tone was the same as usual, with a little anger towards Maureen. Maureen opened his mouth. He didn't know how to explain it all. Hufflepuff went to him just because he was an invisible man, but Maureen himself didn't understand the invisible man. It seemed that many people who had nothing to do with him knew that Maureen was invisible, but they just didn't explain what invisible really meant. At first, he thought that invisible simply meant that he couldn't be predicted, but the Bloody Baron told Maureen that invisible was far from that, so he couldn't know about it. But both Arnold and the Bloody Baron warned Maureen not to reveal the fact of invisible, so he didn't plan to say it. "I don't know, Professor, maybe it's because Hufflepuff likes me more," Maureen said perfunctorily. The wrinkles on Professor Sinistra's face twitched slightly, and her brows were furrowed, like a ball of twine tangled together. She was not satisfied with Maureen's answer. "Maureen, 3 ghosts have disappeared and they all seem to be related to you. Myrtle said that before Helena disappeared, she asked her to remind you not to go to the Forbidden Forest, but you went there anyway. The Bloody Baron also disappeared shortly after Helena disappeared, and the last person he saw was you. Now Professor Binns has suddenly disappeared, but you knew Professor Binns's last name earlier than any of us, and then there are the patterns that keep appearing on the stone arches. 9 of the 12 you drew have already appeared. You always seem to know things you shouldn't know." Headmaster McGonagall looked at Maureen. "Are you hiding anything else from us?" Chapter 433 The 10th Pattern. The Black Cube. Maureen said in a deep voice, "Didn't Professor Hagrid mention the Black Cube to you? Lucas and the others are looking for the 12 Black Cubes. Professor Hagrid should have mentioned the turmoil of the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest and the explosion deep in the Forbidden Forest to you, right? Hagrid did mention the so-called Black Cube, but I have never heard of it, and none of the professors present have heard of the rumors about the Black Cube." Principal McGonagall said, "We don't know what the Black Cube you are talking about is. Professor Adams has seen it." Maureen pointed at Professor Adams and said, "He should be the last descendant of the Adams family." All the professors looked at Professor Adams. Professor Adams was a little nervous being looked at by so many people. He wiped his sweat and whispered, "I have seen it, but I don't know what it does." Professor Adams couldn't even perform basic magic well, let alone guard the Black Cube. When his parents died, they didn't tell him the origin of the Black Cube. Maureen took out his wand and waved it at a weed not far away. A piece of grass flew to him. He cast a transfiguration spell to turn the grass into the shape of a black cube, and then said, "That thing looks like this." The black cube looked like a black head from the outside. There was nothing special about it. Even if it was used to build a wall, it would not be considered wrong. No one thought it would be so important. "I've seen this. Last time at the Dumbledore Cup, Zimmerman turned a piece of stone into it," Professor Kane said. "That was just a magic trick he cast," Maureen said. The black cube in Zimmerman's hand was real. It also attracted a monster at that time. Many people knew about this, but no one could see how the monster came from at that time, because only Maureen could see it. Professor Francis frowned, took the black cube and asked, "What is it used for?" "I don't know, but the Hufflepuff Dean said it's very important. You should explain things more clearly." "Walker," Professor Francis said coldly, "what else do you know about this black cube?" "Professor, if you really care about the black cube, you should try to stop Lucas's conspiracy instead of questioning me." Maureen was a little annoyed by Professor Francis' questioning. "Catch Lucas and take back the black cubes. Then you can study them yourself, right?" Maureen didn't say that the black cube was the key to the stone archway. He felt that the more he explained, the more confusing it would be. You know, even Professor Binns knew about the black cube, but he didn't tell the professors in the school about it, and left without saying a word. Obviously, he was also worried about something. Arnold also said that the fewer people who knew about this, the better. He still trusted Arnold's words more. Professor Francis stared at Maureen with a suspicious look. He knew that Maureen was not telling the truth, but Maureen did not avoid it and looked at Professor Francis calmly. Maureen was really tired of the arguments such as "this is an adult matter, children should not interfere and second-year students do not need to know the black magic etc. "We will always pay attention to this matter," said Principal McGonagall. "Paying attention is not enough. You should find a way to find the descendants of the 12 families and protect the black cube, or directly catch Lucas and stop him from continuing to look for the next black cube." When Maureen said this, his eyes inadvertently stayed on the stone archway, and suddenly he opened his eyes wide in surprise. "What's wrong?" Everyone was looking at Maureen and found that Maureen's expression was not right, and they all felt strange. The 10th pattern. Maureen stared at the stone archway, and suddenly a feeling of uneasiness surged in his heart. Principal McGonagall and others also turned around. Their eyes fell on the stone archway, and they were also slightly stunned. There were originally only 9 patterns on the stone arch, and these patterns were deeply engraved on the stone pillars, about an inch deep. But at some point, the 10th pattern suddenly appeared on the stone arch. This pattern was not as deep as the other patterns, but it seemed to be painted on the stone. And this pattern, Maureen recognized it at once. It was the pattern of 2 fangs. How could it be? Could it be that? Some thoughts flashed through Maureen's mind, and he suddenly thought of the meaning of the existence of the stone arch of Hogwarts. If so, then things will get worse and worse. This 10th pattern, as expected, it was also drawn by you on paper. Principal McGonagall looked at her drawings, and then compared them with the patterns that suddenly appeared on the stone arch. She didn't quite understand. Why? Why did the stone arch appear the 10th pattern at this time? What does the appearance of these patterns mean? "This means," Maureen said in a muffled voice, "the 10th black cube is also in danger." "How do you know?" Professor Francis asked. "Don't you understand yet? Professor Adams' restaurant was attacked by Lucas during the summer vacation, and the Centaur's black cube was also lost during the summer vacation. Lucas also attacked a Muggle building during the summer vacation and stole another black cube. And Paingard must know where his family's black cube is." After these black cubes gathered together, the school's stone arch appeared. Maureen said quickly. He suddenly understood the reason why the stone arch appeared. Once a black cube was in danger, the stone arch would appear, which was equivalent to a warning. "You mean, Lucas has got the 10th black cube?" Professor Kane said. "I'm afraid so, or the latest novel is first published on the 69th book bar." Maureen took a look at the fang pattern of the Sweet family. "This pattern is different from the other 9 patterns. It just appeared." Maureen continued, "The stone arch is predicting the safety of the black cube. If a black cube appears, it is estimated that it will be in danger. Once it is engraved into the stone arch, it means, has it been obtained by Lucas?" Principal McGonagall frowned. "Clive. Floyd, oh no, you have to go find him quickly. He is guarding the 10th black cube. If my guess is right, the pattern has just appeared, which means Lucas has not obtained it yet. It may be in time to rush over now." Maureen said anxiously. Who is Floyd? Professor Francis asked. Sweet's father, from the Clive family. Like Professor Adams, he is also one of the 12 families. Maureen said. Why do you know so much? Professor Francis always managed to catch the doubts when Maureen spoke. He was very logical and often suspected Maureen. But Maureen said angrily, Are you sure, Professor? Now is the time to ask this? Haven't you always wanted to know what the black cube is? What is the stone arch? Are the 12 families mentioned by Hufflepuff true or false? Of course we want to know, then go and verify it. You have time to question me, but not to verify the truth of all this. Maureen turned around and jumped off the stone platform, running quickly towards the castle. Professor Francis shouted coldly from behind, Where are you going? Looking for Sweet. Maureen said without looking back, His father is in trouble. Chapter 434 Crisis. Maureen was not sure if he was right, but he had to verify it now. Whether Principal McGonagall and the others believed him or not, he didn't care. He rushed into the castle gate and ran towards the stairs. It was lunchtime, and Sweet usually ate quickly and then ran to the library. But when he ran to the stairs, he saw Sweet jumping down the stairs with a look of doubt on his face. I was just looking for you. Maureen said anxiously. Something is wrong. Sweet said with gritted teeth. What do you feel? Maureen asked in a deep voice. Sweet shook his head and said, I don't know, but it seems that I can't tell what's wrong. Your father. Although Maureen didn't know how Sweet noticed that something was wrong, he quickly explained the matter of the stone arch. After listening to it, Sweet's face suddenly turned pale. He doesn't look like someone who will get into trouble. His blood curse is very powerful, Sweet said sullenly. Pingate is also from the 12 families. He is also very powerful, not to mention that he has a very powerful arithmetic fortune teller to help him. Maureen said seriously, If he wants to find your father. Maureen did not continue, but his words were very clear. Pingate is a wizard with extremely rich magical knowledge. He has lived for hundreds of years and knows more about the abilities of other families than anyone else. If he wants to deal with the abilities of wizards from other families, it is not a difficult task. Sweet's eyes flickered and he gritted his teeth and said, Help me and see what's going on. I can help you, but Maureen turned around and saw Principal McGonagall and her group walking towards this side. I'm afraid the professors won't. Principal McGonagall had already strode towards Maureen, and her stern eyes swept over Maureen and Sweet. Professor, this matter cannot be hesitated. Maureen was not afraid. If they did not agree, he and Sweet could only go there by themselves, no matter what method they used. But Principal McGonagall made a decision. I will let Professor Kane and Professor Francis go with you to investigate this matter thoroughly, if what you said is true. After all, this matter is related to the stone arch of the school. Principal McGonagall said slowly. Okay. Maureen nodded. He didn't expect Principal McGonagall to believe them. This decision made Maureen relieved. If Professor Kane and Professor Francis followed him, then they wouldn't have to face two dark wizards alone. But, Principal McGonagall said sternly, no matter what happens, you two are not allowed to take risks. If Lucas is really there, Professor Kane and Professor Francis will solve it. And after you come back, you'd better explain everything to me clearly. Yes, Principal, we understand. Maureen nodded. Professor Francis glanced at Maureen and Sweet coldly and said, Where are you going? A town called Peters. Sweet took out his wand and cut his hand. A drop of blood spread out and turned into blood mist. A park scene had appeared inside. What kind of magic is this? Professor Francis frowned and looked at Sweet's movements. This is not normal magic. Principal McGonagall and others also felt something was wrong. With their eyes, they could see that the magic fluctuations emitted by this magic were very strange and special, which was beyond the magic level of a second-year student. I don't know, Professor. Sweet replied sullenly, My mother taught me. Professor Francis looked at Sweet, then glanced at Maureen, and then said, Let's go. He didn't say anything more, turned around and walked towards the castle gate. Maureen and Sweet hurriedly followed, and Professor Kane followed closely behind. I don't know if this is a good idea, but anyway, Maureen, you are not allowed to wander around and you can't leave us. Professor Kane wrapped his wizard robe tightly, and they hurriedly left the castle and walked towards the school gate. You'd better let us believe that what you said is true, otherwise Walker, I can guarantee that your days in school this semester will not be easy. Professor Francis said coldly. Everything I said is true. Maureen said in a deep voice. The four of them walked out of the dark iron gate of Hogwarts and walked along the forest path towards the direction of Hogsmeade Village. However, they did not go to Hogsmeade Village. After they walked out of the magical protection range of Hogwarts School, Professor Kane grabbed Maureen, and Professor Francis took Sweet, and the four of them disappeared from the spot together. The latest novel is published on the 6th book bar on September 9th. When they appeared in the town of Peters, Professor Kane and Professor Francis suddenly changed their faces and looked into the distance at the same time. There was thick smoke, countless spells were shooting and whistling, many muggles were screaming in panic, and the cars on the roadside had been overturned on the ground, some cars were even split in half, and some cars were on fire. There were still many muggles lying on the roadside. Oh no! Something's wrong! Maureen shouted, "Professor, we have to hurry over there, there's a fight." Maureen pointed to the street ahead. Floyd's home was 5 streets away, and that was also the source of the magic fluctuations. "Take me there," Sweet said in a deep voice. Professor Francis and Professor Kane both drew their wands at the same time and looked at each other. They also realized the seriousness of the matter. Francis shook his head and said, "All the streets here are blocked by anti-apparition spells. You can't apparate on the streets." He walked quickly to the entrance of the park, squatted down to check on a Muggle youth lying on the lawn. The young man had his eyes closed, his whole body twitching constantly, and he kept screaming, "Don't chase me, don't." Professor Francis put his hand on the young man's neck, a trace of disgust appeared in his eyes, and said, "Morpheus's whisper actually uses this kind of spell." "What?" Professor Kane was slightly surprised. He ran to another man lying on the steps, reached out to feel his breath. "Damn, he's also been hit by this spell." "What kind of spell is this, Professor?" Maureen asked, puzzled. "Morpheus's whisper is a very powerful black magic," Professor Kane said seriously, with the same disgust on his face as Professor Francis. "Nightmare magic implants nightmares in people. People will encounter the things they fear most in their dreams. If they die in their dreams, they will also die in reality. Muggles have no resistance to this. We have to save them quickly." "So serious?" Maureen was shocked. It was the first time he heard of this kind of black magic. "Can a nightmare kill you?" Maureen glanced at the street and found that many muggles were lying on the ground twitching. Many muggles closed their eyes and screamed in fear. Some people were already foaming at the mouth, and some even covered their chests tightly, as if they were about to suffocate. The scene was in chaos. Even the muggle's pet dog fell to the ground with cramps in his legs. Last time, this town had been cast a dancing curse, and all the muggles started dancing. But this time, all the muggles were entangled by black magic again. Chapter 435 Nightmare Town. "Professor, how can we save them?" Maureen shouted. "Burn their dreams," Professor Francis said indifferently. Even in this situation, his voice still sounded cold. "How to burn it?" Maureen asked. "Green flame burns dreams." Professor Francis and Professor Kane stood up and chanted a spell at the same time. Then they waved their wands. A green flame jumped out of their wands and covered the heads of the 2 muggles. The flames immediately wrapped their heads. The green flames quickly penetrated into their brains and disappeared. Both of them hugged their heads in pain, as if their heads were about to split. At the same time, a wisp of black smoke came out from their hair. Soon, the 2 muggles whose heads were burned by the green flame stopped twitching, but they had no intention of waking up. They had fallen into coma. However, Maureen found that at least their breathing had stabilized. They will be in a coma for several hours, depending on their own situation. Maureen, learn the spell quickly. Help. We don't know what nightmares these muggles have. If they can't hold on in their dreams, they will die. Professor Kane swung his wand again, and several flames came out from the tip of his wand, flying towards the 2 old men of his subordinates not far away. "Blue flames burn dreams, blue flames burn dreams." Maureen remembered Professor Kane's wand-waving movements at a glance. He tried several times, and on the 5th time, he finally succeeded in casting the spell, but his fire spell was not as boiling and powerful as Professor Francis and Professor Kane's. It seemed very awkward, and he was not very proficient in this magic. Maureen swung his wand, and the blue flame sank into Pet Dog. He only dared to experiment with the pet dog first. The pet dog screamed twice, then curled up, black smoke came out of its head, and stopped screaming. It seemed that the nightmare had been burned away by Maureen. "It's okay, it's working a little bit." Before Maureen could breathe a sigh of relief, Sweet, who was beside him, had already run towards the place where the magic battle was taking place in the distance. "Sweet, wait a minute!" Professor Francis shouted. He followed him angrily, ready to stop Sweet, but Sweet had already passed the corner. The magical fluctuations on the street were very chaotic, and the apparition could not be used. Maureen and Professor Kane could only follow behind Sweet. As they ran, they waved their wands and cast the dream-burning spell at the muggles they saw along the street. The blue flames flew all over the street, looking for the muggles who were hit by the dark magic. They had to do this. If they didn't save people first, I'm afraid these muggles would not survive. Maureen and the others just ran past a corner and found that there was a house in front of them, burning with raging fire. Professor Kane casually cast a powerful spring charm to put out the fire in the house. Where are the people from the Ministry of Magic? Damn, such a big thing happened, and they didn't come to deal with it, Professor Kane said angrily. Professor Francis raised his head and looked at the place where the battle was taking place in the distance. He said, "From the perspective of the spell, there are at least 10 wizards there. I'm afraid the people from the Ministry of Magic have gone to arrest them." 10 wizards? How can there be so many? Maureen asked in surprise. Shouldn't there be only Lucas and the old witch? Professor Francis glanced at Maureen and waved his wand again to move the bus in front of him that had crashed into the street lamp beside the road. The windshield of the bus had been shattered. The driver was lying on the steering wheel and screaming. Many passengers in the entire car were also screaming in panic in their seats. Some people even lay in the car and twitched. A thick smoke was coming out of the front of the car. Professor Francis flicked his wand, and the thick smoke from the bus immediately rolled up and turned into green flames. These flames flowed quickly, jumping into the crowd on the bus and pouring into their heads. Professor Francis waved his wand again, and the top of the bus was lifted by him. Then several bandages appeared in the air, which wrapped up all the muggles in the bus and took them all out of the bus. Maureen didn't have the magic skills as skilled as Professor Francis. He cast a few dream-burning spells to help remove the muggles' dark magic, and then ran towards Sweet quickly. "Maureen, don't run around." Professor Kane rescued a group of couples from the car. Seeing that Maureen had run far away, he immediately ran towards Maureen. "Professor, I won't be reckless. I'm just going to watch Sweet." Maureen swept away the broken pieces of the collapsed wall in front of him while running. Sweet had disappeared in the alley. He had already seen the familiar street. As long as he turned around this street, he could see Floyd's house, but Sweet couldn't move forward half a step. There was a transparent barrier in front of him, blocking him. Maureen ran to Sweet, panting. He tapped the barrier with his wand, and the barrier emitted a transparent wave. "This is a confinement spell. We can't get through it." Maureen shook his head. This spell was obviously cast by the Ministry of Magic, seemingly to prevent someone from escaping. With Maureen's ability, it was impossible to break the magic barrier cast by the Aurors. The latest novels are published on the 69th book bar. Sweet gritted his teeth, the muscles on his face were tense, and his eyes were very anxious. He hadn't spoken a word from just now until now. "Don't worry, the Ministry of Magic is here. If Lucas and the others come here, he won't have a good end." Maureen bypassed the street. He wanted to find a wide view to check the situation inside, but the house blocked his view and he couldn't see what was happening there. From time to time, there were sounds of magic spells whistling in the distance, shattering the glass of the house, and many wizards were roaring. "Let's go up." Maureen looked up at the house next to him. This house was a 2-story villa. If he stood on the roof, he should be able to see the situation there. Many streets in this town were blocked and could not be apparated. There was a big hole in the wall next to him, and the ground was full of rubble. It seemed that a layer of ice first formed on this wall, and then it was shattered by someone using a shattering spell. There were ice chips on the rubble. Maureen pointed his wand at a pile of ruins and rubble next to him and shouted softly, "Change in an instant." The rubble immediately rolled up and formed a series of steps, entwining each other and extending to the roof. Maureen and Sweet worked together to transform all the shovels, swing boards and other things that could be seen on the ground into steps under their feet. The two of them stepped on the steps and stumbled all the way to the roof of the house. But when they saw the battle situation on the opposite side clearly, their faces suddenly changed. Chapter 436 Lucas. Countless flames and smoke spells flew everywhere. The houses around were blown to pieces. The trees on both sides of the road had been uprooted and were flying in the air under the control of wizards. Some branches had already ignited purple flames. Many people who looked like aurors were hiding behind the trees to find various covers, and from time to time they fired spells at a person in the distance. Standing in the center of the battlefield was a man in Muggle clothes. He was surrounded by red ripples. These ripples formed ripples and blocked all the auror's spells. This person turned out to be Floyd. Maureen and Sweet were shocked. They originally thought that the aurors were dealing with Lucas and the Old Witch, but they never expected that this group of people would join forces to deal with Floyd. How could this happen? Why? How could the people from the Ministry of Magic? Sweet clenched his fists and stared at Floyd, who was besieged by the aurors, his expression full of panic and confusion. Maureen was also in a state of confusion. What on earth were the aurors of the Ministry of Magic doing? Shouldn't their target be Lucas? But what surprised Maureen the most was that Floyd was able to deal with so many aurors alone and was not at a disadvantage. The red ripples surrounding him were very strange and powerful. The auror's spells rushed past and were all blocked outside by the red ripples. The Muggle houses on the entire street had been blown to pieces by the spells. Only the house of Floyd's family was covered with a layer of red ripples that seemed to be there and not there, protecting the house intact. "Lucas, the entire street has been blocked by us. You can't escape." An auror waved a wall in front to avoid Floyd's red spell. He shouted while shooting spells at Floyd. "I'm not Lucas. Are you crazy?" Floyd's wand was waved in front of him, forming phantoms, and countless red spells flew in the air, forcing back all the aurors who wanted to get close. The power of those red spells was extremely terrifying. The aurors' various spells could not break them. They could only dodge in panic. 10 aurors besieged together, but they could not get close to the house. A female auror stood on the roof of a truck and shot countless purple spells at Floyd. She shouted, "You dare to quibble? Lucas, you cast dark magic on Muggles and killed so many people." According to the Ministry of Magic Muggle Protection Agreement Article 3, Section 24, Yule, but before the female auror finished reading her terms, Floyd had already thrown a red spell and went towards her. She waved her wand forward and sent out a powerful barrier spell, but the barrier spell was directly shattered by Floyd's spell and fell on the truck, instantly blasting the truck into a pile of scrap metal. The pile of scrap metal was filled with a layer of red light, and then rolled up, forming a giant hand, grabbing the female auror and pressing her against the wall on the corner of the street, making her unable to move. "Enough, you ignorant aurors, I've already told you that I didn't do the dark magic among the Muggles. You don't save them now, but you still have time to catch me." Floyd looked very angry. His eyes had completely turned red, just like Sweet's eyes. Under the sunlight, they were particularly dazzling, just like a red-eyed devil, relying on powerful magic to suppress the group of aurors. Maureen was also amazed. It was obvious that Floyd was using the special ability of the Clive family, the blood curse. His control of the blood curse was many times more powerful than the blood curse that Sweet used to deal with paying aid. It was also the first time that Maureen saw the power of the blood curse of the Clive family. No wonder paying aid had taken a fancy to Sweet and had a very high opinion of the Clive family. With such a powerful magic ability, if paying aid could take this power for himself by controlling Sweet's body, then paying aid's strength would probably be even stronger. "Lucas, you have done all kinds of evil and hurt so many innocent people. It's not too late for you to surrender without repenting." A short wizard wearing a pointed wizard hat stood in front of a row of fences. He was quickly shooting spells at Floyd. His spells were very tricky and always attacked Floyd from different directions. The spells hit the red ripples in front of Floyd, and actually cracked the red ripples. Although this crack was fleeting, it was much more powerful than others. You know, the spells of other aurors can only create ripples on the ripples at most, but this wizard's spell, Mullen's pupils suddenly shrank. He had been focusing on Floyd, who was besieged by a dozen aurors. If it weren't for the wizard's words, he wouldn't even notice the wizard's true identity. "Old witch. My God. That's an old witch," Mullen exclaimed. "Who?" Sweet asked in a muffled voice. Maureen pointed at the short wizard and said angrily, "It's that old witch. That man is called Moira, old witch." Sweet said in surprise, "He's a man." Maureen reacted and immediately understood something not good. "Oh, that old witch is arithmetic divination magic. She must have disguised herself as an auror. The old witch's arithmetic divination magic is very advanced. She doesn't need to use Polyjuice Potion. She can disguise herself as another person simply by relying on arithmetic divination magic. Even Magatha, who is proficient in arithmetic divination, has been fooled." These experienced Aurors seem to have been fooled by her and regarded her as one of their own. But her disguise can't fool Maureen. And it seems that there is another person at the scene who knows the true identity of the short wizard. The latest novels are first published on the 6th-9th book bar. All of Floyd's spells were focused on the old witch. His red eyes seemed to see through everything. He shouted at the old witch, "Who are you? Don't think I can't see through your tricks. You are not a real Auror. Nonsense won't give you a chance to escape, Lucas." The old witch's wand slowly circled with Floyd. She also dodged desperately, as if she was unable to fight, but every time the wand could just block Floyd's magic. "I don't know who Lucas is at all. You should figure things out first," Floyd shouted angrily. He waved a spell at the old witch, but the old witch dodged it. The old witch counterattacked with a gray spell. "Don't play dumb. We have enough evidence to prove that you're Lucas. Do you think we don't recognize you just because you changed your face?" Another middle-aged wizard shouted. "Don't waste your time talking to him, Hanson. Take him down first," said the Auror disguised as an old witch. When Maureen set his sights on the Auror named Hanson, he was shocked again. This guy turned out to be the real Lucas in disguise. He never expected that Lucas and the old witch would be so bold that they would sneak into the Aurors to deal with Floyd. Not to mention that these two people were crying thief and insisted that Floyd was the most wanted criminal, Lucas. Chapter 437, The Spy Among the Aurors. Damn it. Maureen suddenly understood why a group of Aurors would join forces to deal with Floyd. There were two spies mixed in with the Aurors, and the Aurors could not tell them apart. Just a few words of incitement were enough to lead the Aurors by the nose and led them to Floyd. A lot of thoughts flashed through Maureen's mind. The more he thought about it, the more frightened he became. He did not expect that the old witch and Lucas would be so cunning. If he guessed correctly, the old witch and Lucas might have deliberately cast black magic on all the Muggles in this town to track all the Aurors, and then disguised themselves as two Aurors, telling these Aurors that the fugitive Lucas was hiding in this town, and then brought the Aurors to find Floyd. The two of them just wanted to use the Aurors to deal with Floyd. Sweet clenched his wand and asked, "Are you sure? That old witch is very powerful. Her disguise can't fool me." Maureen stood on the roof, stretched out his wand and cast a transfiguration spell in front of him, trying to turn the abandoned car door in the distance into a mirror to deal with the old witch, but his spell hit the magic barrier and disappeared directly. This magic barrier blocked him outside, and even the transfiguration spell couldn't penetrate it. "But how is this possible?" Sweet said in a deep voice. "Are those Aurors idiots? How come no one noticed something wrong?" "It's nothing. I heard that there was a dark wizard who used Polyjuice Potion to deceive Headmaster Dumbledore and taught at the school for a year, and in this case, how could the Aurors pay attention to the two spies mixed in their team?" Maureen was anxious. Now it seemed that only he and Floyd discovered that the old witch and Lucas were disguised. Those Aurors have already determined that the dark magic in this town was cast by Floyd, and they will definitely not listen to Floyd's explanation. Moreover, as a student, he was blocked outside, so his words were not very convincing. "What are you two doing up there? I told you not to run around," Professor Kane shouted from the corner below. He had just run out of her house, rescued two unconscious children from the ruins, and conjured up a big bed to put the two children on the bed. "Professor! Help!" Maureen shouted to Professor Kane. "Those Aurors caught the wrong person. Lucas is mixed in with the Aurors." "What?" Professor Kane looked at Maureen in confusion, not quite understanding what Maureen was saying. "Come up, Professor. Come here and look." Maureen waved to Professor Kane quickly. Professor Kane hesitated for a moment, followed the steps made by Maureen and Sweet, ran to the roof, came to Maureen and Sweet, looked across, and gasped. "Who is this person? How could he destroy the street like this?" Professor Kane said in surprise. A dozen Aurors fought with Floyd, and the whole street was in ruins, but the battle still did not stop. "Sweet's father, Professor, he was framed. That old witch and Lucas are mixed in with the Aurors," Maureen said quickly. Sweet gritted his teeth and said nothing. "Is he the one from the Clive family you mentioned?" Professor Kane frowned slightly. "Why are those Aurors arresting him?" "Those two people, Professor, I don't know if you can see that those two people are the old witch and Lucas." Maureen pointed to the two fake Aurors to Professor Kane. Professor Kane hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Maureen, how do you know?" "There's nothing special about them. I know one of them, Hanson, who became an Auror just 2 years after graduation. That's the one. I just heard the old witch call him that. He's just in disguise. Maureen said, Professor, I'm not lying, believe me once. You should know that I rarely make mistakes in what I say. Professor Kane pondered for a moment, shook his head and said, it's useless for me to believe you, Maureen. If those two are really in disguise, Floyd, that's the name, right, he shouldn't confront the Aurors, it will only make things worse. Is he just going to surrender, Professor? Sweet's voice was mixed with anger. If he didn't do it, it wouldn't matter even if he was caught by the Aurors. The Aurors will find out who cast the dark magic, Sweet. Professor Kane said seriously, but he has caused such great damage now and is fighting against the Aurors. He may be charged with resisting arrest, Professor. I don't think things are that simple. Maureen stared at the old witch and Lucas, and said, Freud knows very well that if he is arrested, the black cube will inevitably fall into the hands of the old witch and Lucas. Isn't the matter of the black cube a purpose of our investigation this time? Professor Kane thought for a moment, and said, okay, I will find a way to explain it to those Aurors later, but don't hold too much hope. I'm just a professor. They may respect me, but they may not listen to me. The most urgent task now is to burn the nightmares of those Muggles, otherwise these Muggles will die. The latest novel is published on 69shoe.com. Professor Kane turned around and swung a green flame at a Muggle lying on the roadside and twitching. Then he said sternly, you two stay here and don't run around. I have to save those Muggles. These Aurors are crazy. They don't know the priorities and don't even care about the lives of Muggles. They should at least send one person. Professor Kane had already run downstairs. Professor Francis in the distance also rushed into a ruin and rescued the two Muggles. I have to help him. Sweet tried hard to cast various spells to break the magic barrier in front of him, but his spells, like Maureen's, dissipated directly. The Auror's barrier was not just a joke. Maureen was also thinking of a way. If it continued like this, the situation would probably get worse and worse. Although Floyd's blood curse magic was powerful, Maureen and Sweet knew that this blood curse was based on one's own blood, which was equivalent to overdrawing one's own body. Not to mention that Floyd had to take time to protect the house behind him while dealing with a dozen Aurors. The old witch and Lucas had been trying to get closer to the house, and most of their spells were shot at the house. Maureen was still wondering why Floyd had to go to the trouble of protecting the house, but he glanced at the house and exclaimed, Nim, he's still in the house. On the window of the house, Nim was leaning on the window with a horrified face, watching the battle outside. Asshole. Unforgivable. Sweet growled angrily. Chapter 438 Framed. Catch the child in the house, and he will surrender, shouted the Auror disguised as the old witch. The other Aurors also reacted. They hadn't encountered such a powerful wizard for a long time. In the past, when the Aurors were on a mission, they did not encounter such obstacles. Those dark wizards usually ran away quickly when they saw the Aurors coming, and they would never stay there. However, Floyd did not run away immediately. On the contrary, he fought with them, obviously to protect his child. Attack that house and distract him. Lucas, disguised as an Auror, also shouted. Some Aurors have realized this and began to shoot spells at the house. These Aurors are bastards. They are firing spells recklessly like this, which will hurt Nim. Sweet was extremely angry. He had always been unwilling to admit that Floyd was his father, but at this juncture, he could not stand idly by, not to mention that there was another one of his younger brothers inside. You are not allowed to come near here. Floyd shouted. He raised his left hand, and waved the wand in his right hand again, sending out a red light, repelling the old witch and Lucas, but his face became paler and paler. Maureen then noticed that his left wrist was bleeding, but strangely, the blood did not flow to the ground, but disappeared directly in the red ripples in front of him. It was this blood that made his magic very powerful, and he alone resisted more than a dozen Aurors and two unfathomable dark wizards. Nim, wait inside. You can't come out. Floyd shouted. He waved a red spell again, and this red spell fell on an oak tree. The trunk and branches of the oak tree all turned into a deep red color, and all the leaves shook rapidly, wrapping around a tall wizard. The tall wizard had originally run to the house from the back, but he was entangled by the oak tree before he ran 2 steps. The red branches wrapped him up in an instant, and his wand was broken by the branches in an instant. Maureen was also furious. These Aurors had already done whatever it took for Floyd. They knew there was an innocent child in the house, but they still fired spells at the house because only in this way could they draw Floyd's attention away. Maureen wanted to help, but he couldn't get through the barrier. Even if he and Sweep could get in, they were no match for these Aurors. The strength of the two of them was nothing compared to these Aurors. Professor Kane and Professor Francis were busy burning the nightmares of other Muggles downstairs to prevent them from being killed by nightmares. No one could help Floyd at the moment. Floyd had retreated to the door of his house. He gritted his teeth, his face getting paler and paler. He was almost at his limit to continue using blood curse magic to deal with so many powerful wizards. The red barrier protecting the entire house was hit by the old witch, and the cracks that appeared did not recover as quickly as before. At this time, the old witch seized the opportunity and continued to attack the crack, blasting a hole in the crack. She cast another gray spell to enlarge the hole, then stepped on the air, and a bouncing spell appeared under her feet, sending her into the hole. She landed in the corridor, broke the window, jumped in, and grabbed Nim. "No. Let him go, you old woman," Floyd roared, not caring to stop the other Aurors, and hurried to the door. But Lucas had already jumped into the corridor through the hole in the barrier, and while Floyd was distracted, he fired a brown spell at him. Floyd screamed in pain, stumbled, and fell in front of the door. The red barrier around him was already full of cracks and was crumbling. The other Aurors quickly cast all their attack spells on the red blood curse barrier. Crash! The barrier was shattered at once, and two spells hit the house directly, creating a huge gap in the house. The wooden boards and glass of the house flew everywhere, and Nim and his mother screamed in fear. Floyd got up from the ground. He looked terrible, but he still rushed into the house. The whole house was suddenly flashing with the light of various spells, mixed with the crying of children and Floyd's roar. Countless powerful spells blew holes in the roof of the house. At this time, the whole house suddenly exuded a strange suction force, and all the debris began to collapse inside, as if a terrifying vortex appeared in the house, swallowing up the whole house. "Lucas is going to destroy the house. Come and help. We can't beat him." The voice of the old witch disguised as an Auror came from the house. She actually used this method to frame Floyd. All the Aurors changed their faces when they saw the house collapse. Lucas had caused countless destructions and was listed as the most wanted criminal. When he committed crimes, he would often collapse the buildings at the scene into a big ball and then escape. But the Ministry of Magic has never caught Lucas. Catch him. The other Aurors immediately ran into the house. They couldn't miss the opportunity to catch Lucas. But at this time, the house was completely broken and everything flew inside. Floyd's angry voice came out, "Your target is indeed the black cube. Stop it, no. Nim." Swish. A red shadow quickly jumped out of the house. Floyd ran out holding Nim and his wife at an incredible speed and fell heavily to the ground. He quickly got up and wanted to check on Nim's condition, but an Auror was quick-eyed and quick-handed, and a coma spell fell on Floyd. Floyd couldn't dodge and fell to the ground. At this moment, a black cone suddenly emerged from the collapsed ruins and hit the barrier above the street. This barrier, which was originally used to prevent apparition, suddenly broke a big hole. The barrier of the entire street began to crumble and even collapsed. The latest novel is published on the 69th book bar. Maureen recognized this black cone at a glance. When Lucas escaped, he relied on this black cone to break the anti-apparition spell. The house made various sharp crackling sounds, but all the Auror's attention was on Floyd, and no one noticed that two wizards in the middle of the house had taken advantage of the chaos to apparition and disappeared. Catch him. An Auror cast a stunning spell with his wand, hitting Floyd again to prevent him from waking up. Another Auror had already taken out a pair of shackles from his pocket and put them on Floyd's hands. These shackles can suppress the magic in wizards, making it impossible for them to cast any magic. "No. You can't catch him." Sweet yelled and ran down the stairs. At this time, the barrier had disappeared. He rushed towards the captured Floyd, but an Auror saw Sweet and grabbed him in an instant. "Where are you from, kid, and you're holding a wand? Don't go over there." The Auror used magic to restrain Sweet in an instant. "He's not Lucas, you caught the wrong person." Maureen also ran over and shouted to the Auror. But he didn't take 2 steps before he was also caught by the Auror's spell. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 439 The Strong Professor. Stop, they are my students. We just happened to pass by here. Professor Kane found that the anti-apparition spell outside had been broken. He immediately ran over and said to the Auror who caught Maureen and Sweet, "Professor Kane." The Auror obviously knew Professor Kane and frowned slightly. "Why are you here?" "Fink, right? Those two are my students," Professor Kane said. "They were doing something nearby and found it a bit bad here, so they rushed over. Aren't you going to save those muggles?" The Auror named Fink let go of Maureen and Sweet, and said in a somewhat arrogant tone, "Professor, catching Lucas is far more important than saving muggles. We have already caught him, it's none of your business. Are you going to let all the muggles in the town die for this?" Professor Kane was a little angry at Fink's attitude. "2 muggles have died in nightmares just now. Professor, if Lucas is not caught, I'm afraid even more muggles will die." Fink glanced at Lucas, who had been caught by other Aurors, and then looked at Professor Kane, because he had graduated from Hogwarts for many years and was no longer afraid of Hogwarts professors. "Besides, this is our Ministry of Magic's business. You'd better, best what?" "Go on, Fink, best what? Is this how you, the Ministry of Magic, do things to the end?" Professor Francis walked over from a distance angrily, looking at Fink coldly. His tone was extremely cold, and the breath of death seemed to be always around him. "Do all the muggles in the town have to die before you will help?" When Fink saw Professor Francis, he was surprisingly scared and shrank his neck. Professor Francis was a very difficult professor to mess with. His classes would leave a deep impression on everyone. Even though Fink had graduated for many years, he was still traumatized by seeing an angry Professor Francis. "Professor Francis, this matter is far from as simple as you think." Fink took a long time to muster up the courage to force a tough attitude. "Professor, if these are your students, I advise you to take them away and delay our investigation. Even if you are a professor at Hogwarts, what will happen?" Professor Francis narrowed his eyes at Fink. His gaze was as sharp as an eagle, forcing Fink to swallow his words. "You want to threaten me? Fink, where do you get the confidence to bring up the Ministry of Magic in front of me? Do you think you can act cool in front of me after being an Auror for a few years?" Fink seemed to be intimidated by Professor Francis. He didn't know how to answer Professor Francis' words. He hesitated and blushed, and muttered, "We are just doing our job." At this time, another gray-haired Auror in the distance noticed the situation here. He immediately came over and put on a smile. "Professor Francis, Professor Kane, why are you two here?" Professor Francis looked at the older Auror expressionlessly. "Nicole, you Aurors are getting more and more stylish in your work." The Auror called Nicole laughed. "Professor Francis, you are joking." After he finished speaking, he turned his head and glared at Fink, saying, "Fink, how did you talk to Professor Francis just now? When Professor Francis was working in the Auror department, you were still wearing open crotch pants. Half of the prisoners in Azkaban were imprisoned by him in those years." Fink's face twitched slightly, and he looked at Professor Francis in fear. He had only been in Auror for 2 years and was not familiar with many things. Even when he was studying at Hogwarts, he had never heard of Professor Francis. He didn't expect that Professor Francis, who was usually cold and often talked about death, had such a big background. Maureen was also slightly surprised. He could not help but turn his head to look at Professor Francis. He was usually annoyed by this professor who liked to threaten students with death. Every time Maureen was questioned about hiding something, Professor Francis would always find loopholes in Maureen's words to make trouble for Maureen. Professor Kane and Professor Flitwick were relatively easy to talk to, but Professor Francis was not so easy to fool. If Nicole hadn't mentioned it, he would not have known that Professor Francis was actually an Auror before. "So how are you doing recently, Professor Francis?" Nicole asked. "Please don't use polite words on me, Nicole, make it clear. What you call handling a case is that you are unwilling to assign someone to save people. Do you know how many muggles in this town have died because of nightmares?" Professor Francis was extremely indifferent, and there was no need to be polite at all. Nicole raised her eyebrows slightly. "In order to catch Lucas, the suspect who broke into the Ministry of Magic, sacrifices are inevitable, 11 in total." Professor Francis interrupted Nicole succinctly. "If Professor Kane and I hadn't arrived in time, I'm afraid half of the muggles in the town would have died. Can your Auror department afford this responsibility? Just rely on a few ignorant novices you brought with you." After Professor Francis finished speaking, he glanced at Fink again. Fink gritted his teeth and didn't dare to look Professor Francis in the eye. Nicole pondered for a moment. If half of the Muggles in the town died, their Aurors would indeed be held accountable. The Auror department arrested criminals on the premise of protecting the lives of Muggles, but this time they had no time to care about those Muggles in order to deal with Lucas. We really didn't think this through, Nicole nodded slightly, but no matter what, we finally caught Lucas. He's not Lucas. The latest novels are first published on the 69th book bar. Maureen didn't like the style of the Aurors. When he and Alton went out, Alton and the others in the Department of Prohibition of Abuse of Muggle Objects were mainly focused on protecting Muggles, while the style of this group of Aurors was completely opposite to that of people in other magic departments. Maureen pointed at Floyd in the distance and said, "That man is not Lucas." "Who are you?" Children should not interrupt when adults are talking. "Professor Francis, you should take care of your students." Nicole was not so polite when talking to Maureen. Professor Francis stared at Maureen with his death gaze. While Maureen was still thinking about how to convince Professor Francis said indifferently, "My student naturally has his reasons for speaking. Nicole, it is not your turn to teach me how to discipline him. If you are clear-headed, you should investigate this matter from many aspects." Maureen was slightly surprised. When Professor Francis was in school, he had always questioned what he said, but he did not expect that Professor Francis would believe him at this time. Chapter 440, Former Auror. Nicole frowned. "Professor Francis, you have to understand that we Aurors do not do things without a purpose. My student has met Lucas. He is qualified to say this." "Nicole, how many times have you met Lucas? How many cards do you know Lucas has in his hand?" Professor Francis asked coldly. "We are confident that we know Lucas better than you do." "Really? Then tell me, how did Lucas get into the Ministry of Magic's dark magic item warehouse? You, the Department of Mysteries, have been tracking him for so long with divination. Why can't you find his whereabouts?" Professor Francis continued to ask. Nicole was choked. He looked a little annoyed, but he didn't show it. Instead, he said, "We will know soon. We have caught him. He will tell it sooner or later." "If I were you, I wouldn't be so sure, Nicole," Professor Francis said coldly. "I can at least point out 5 suspicious points about the traces and distribution of magic in this town. The magic on this person and the magic in the Muggle's body are not from the same person. The dark magic in the Muggle's body was cast by 2 wizards. One of them is very advanced. He used some arithmetic divination magic to cover up the traces, but he couldn't hide it from me, because I have seen this method before, and it is completely different from the method used by the wizard you caught." And Professor Francis paused here and glanced coldly at all the Aurors present. The 2 dark wizards who cast Murphy's Whisper on the Muggles were just concentrating their firepower here to deal with that house. Their traces of magic are also revealed here. I want to know why the 2 dark wizards want to assist you in dealing with that wizard. Professor Francis, are you trying to tell me that it was our Aurors who cast the dark magic on the Muggles? Nicole put away his smile, looked at Professor Francis with a bad look, and said, "I hope you will be more careful with your words, Professor Francis. I am just giving you a suggestion, Nicole, to prevent you from being blinded by some quick success and instant benefits." Professor Francis did not care about Nicole's attitude. Nicole's face was uncertain, and Professor Francis' words seemed to make him very uncomfortable. As if to divert his attention, he used his magic wand to repair the collapsed wall in front of him, and then said, "We will find out. Excuse me, professors, if there is nothing else, please take your students away from here. I have other things to deal with." Nicole gestured to Fink, and then the 2 of them strode towards the chaotic ruins over there, directing others to use their magic wands to deal with the house that was sucked into a ball by the magnet. Other Aurors were busy repairing other Muggle houses that were destroyed by magic. Maureen knew that Professor Francis was very powerful, but he didn't expect him to be so powerful. He just taught a lesson to a new Auror who didn't know his own limits, and then he rudely scolded an old Auror. Not only that, he could actually see so many clues at the scene with just his eyes. "You know, Maureen hasn't told Professor Francis what he knows yet." Professor Francis saw that Nicole had gone far away, snorted disdainfully, then turned to look at Maureen and said coldly, "Are you going to tell me everything now, Maureen?" Professor Kane said, "Maureen, Professor Francis is very good at dealing with dark magic. He used to be an extremely outstanding Auror. You just said that there were 2 people pretending to be Aurors. What's going on?" Maureen hesitated for a moment, and then briefly told this story, but as for when they came to this town, Maureen only said that he and Sweet happened to come here during Christmas. How did you know that those two people were pretending? Professor Francis asked. I have met them several times and I am very familiar with them, Maureen said. Professor Francis fell into deep thought. Sweet had brought him, who was crying and shouting for his father. Two Aurors had taken their father back to the Ministry of Magic. Nim's mother was a Muggle. She looked seriously injured and was lying on the sidewalk. An Auror was treating him, but Nim was not seriously injured. Don't cry, Sweet said with a heavy face. If you want to save us, Sweet gritted his teeth and changed his words. If you want to save your father, tell me what you know. Nim looked very flustered, with tears on his face. I don't know what happened. Just now, the neighbors suddenly started screaming wildly. Dad brought me back and asked me to stay in the house, but this group of people suddenly went crazy with wooden sticks. Their wooden sticks are terrible, and Dad also has one. Nim cried and spoke, but his words were unclear, and he didn't seem to understand the whole thing very well. In addition, he was very frightened and couldn't help them much. Sweet closed his eyes, took a deep breath, then slowly opened his eyes, looked at Nim, and said word by word, "Don't cry, we will find a way." He turned to look at Professor Francis and said, "Professor, what's your father's name, Sweet?" Professor Francis asked, "What's his real name? If someone falsely accuses him of being Lucas, I at least need to know his name." "Goodwin Floyd Clive, that's what my mother told me before," Sweet responded. As soon as he finished speaking, Professor Francis' face suddenly changed. "What did you say his name was?" Professor Francis asked again. Sweet noticed that Professor Francis looked a little strange, but he didn't understand why, so he repeated it again. "Goodwin Floyd Clive." Goodwin? How could it be this name? The latest novels are first published on the 69th book bar. Professor Francis's well-defined face twitched slightly, and his eyes began to waver. He glanced at Sweet again, as if recalling something. "Then have you heard of Scarlet Blood Hand, Sweet?" "I haven't heard of it. Does this name have any meaning?" Sweet asked. "Scarlet Blood Hand, this name. Wait." Professor Kane seemed to have remembered something and said in surprise, "Oh, I remember this name, Francis. Isn't this person? He is hiding in this town." "Professor, do you know my father?" Sweet asked anxiously. Professor Francis' eyes flickered twice. Instead of answering Sweet's question directly, he asked, "You've never seen him before?" "He left when I was very young," Sweet whispered. "So you don't know his past either, right?" Professor Francis asked again, "You don't know what kind of person your father is?" "Professor, what do you mean by that?" Sweet asked. Professor Francis and Professor Kane looked at each other, with some strange meanings in their eyes. "He may really not know, Professor Francis. Maybe it's just the same name?" "We didn't know about Scarlet Blood Hand before," Professor Kane said. "Anyway, I will investigate this matter." Professor Francis pondered for a moment and continued, "If Scarlet Blood Hand." Chapter 441 Corpses in the Ruins. Maureen and Sweet looked at each other. Why did they feel that Professor Francis and Professor Kane seemed to know something about the past? "Professor, what do you mean?" Sweet felt something was wrong. Why did the two professors at Hogwarts know his father? Maureen suddenly remembered something. Last time, Freud mentioned that he couldn't go to Hogwarts to find Sweet. Could these two things be related? Professor Francis pondered for a long time, and looked at Sweet again. If it is really him, this matter will be very tricky. Why is it tricky? "Professor, you clearly know that he was framed," Sweet said. "You were able to judge who the wizard who cast the spell was based on those magical traces, which should prove that the person who cast a black magic was not him, and Maureen can also testify. Things are not as simple as you think, but Maureen can see through other people's disguises, and his testimony is not favorable." Professor Francis shook his head and looked at Sweet again. "If you didn't know it before, then I think it's good that you don't have to understand it now." "Professor, I want to know." Sweet clenched his fists, put his hand on Nim's shoulder, and said, "I want to know his past, no matter who it is, for I must know." Professor Francis did not answer immediately. He seemed to be considering whether to tell the story about Goodwin. "Things may not necessarily develop into the worst situation, Francis, maybe not." Professor Kane hesitated. Professor Francis nodded slightly and said, "Anyway, I will go and confirm this matter first, and then make a conclusion based on the investigation results of the Ministry of Magic. You two don't need to worry about this matter, go back to school first." "But Professor," Sweet didn't want to leave. Professor Francis glanced at the Aurors who were busy in the distance, and his eyes fell on Nicole again, saying, "I don't like to say bad things about others, but to be honest, Nicole is stubborn and eager for quick success. He will not consider the consequences when arresting wizard prisoners, and Lucas is a repeat offender. If he insists that the previous Lucas was pretended by your father, Professor," Maureen said from the side, "you can investigate the two problematic Aurors. They are pretended by the old witch and Lucas. One of the Aurors is named Hansen. I remember Professor Kane said this. They just broke into that room and didn't come out, right? I think they must have apparated away during the chaos. The staff of the Ministry of Magic only need to find the real Hansen and the other Auror, and they will know about this." Before Maureen could finish his words, there was a commotion in the distance. Many Aurors seemed to be shouting something. Many people ran towards the squeezed house. The house that was sucked into a ball by the Locan magnet had been restored by the Aurors using magic. Everyone seemed to be gathered there for something. Professor Francis also ran over. The scene was very chaotic. Then Maureen saw two people being lifted out of the ruins by the Aurors using magic. They were already bloody and their limbs were twisted irregularly. They hardly looked like human figures. There were torn wizard robes mixed with mud and blood on their bodies and stuck to the wall. It could be vaguely seen that they were wizard robes that only the Aurors of the Ministry of Magic had. Maureen took a breath of cold air. He felt that things were completely bad. Professor Francis had come back with a sullen face. He looked at Maureen indifferently. His eyes were calm, as if he had seen death for a long time. He said slowly, "Two Aurors died, Hansen and Richard. How could it be? Those two Aurors were obviously disguised." The thing that Maureen was most worried about still happened. He originally thought that as long as he found the two Aurors who were impersonated, he could prove Floyd's innocence, but he didn't expect that the two Aurors would die in the ruins. How dare they? How dare they kill people directly? Sweet was also deeply shocked. Professor Francis' voice was extremely cold. "Do you think that all dark wizards are kind-hearted?" Maureen was speechless at this time. The lock magnet can suck the house into a solid iron ball. If a person is sucked in, he will definitely become a pool of blood mud, but the two Aurors can still vaguely recognize their forms. It is obvious that the old witch and Lucas deliberately used magic to protect the body. I'm afraid that the two Aurors had been killed by the old witch and Lucas, but the bodies were brought to the old witch's side by dark magic. When all the Aurors were focusing on catching Floyd, they took the bodies out and placed them in the house, and then destroyed them along with the house. They were originally planning to frame Floyd as Lucas, and now two more Aurors have died. It's probably difficult for Floyd to clear his suspicion after being caught. We should go back. We shouldn't have brought you here. Professor Kane sighed. Sweet's lips turned pale. At this point, he was a little confused. But seeing Nim running back to his mother sobbing, he forced himself to calm down. Professor, he is my brother. I can't leave him alone. Sweet clenched his fists. How can you take care of him? Stay away from school to accompany him. Professor Francis asked coldly. Sweet lowered his head and took a deep breath. What will the people from the Ministry of Magic do to them? Sweet asked. The latest novel is published on 69 Shuba. Aurors will handle all this. They will heal Nim's mother. Your father has been living with them. The Ministry of Magic will force them to check their memories, but they will not do anything to them. At most, their memories will be modified and they will be monitored again. Professor Kane said. In the distance, Nim's mother had sat up. Her injuries were healed by the Aurors, but she looked very panicked. She held Nim tightly and kept crying. Sweet didn't say anything, just looked at Nim. His eyes became very lonely. Professor Kane grabbed Maureen and Sweet, and apparated away from the town. After returning to school, Professor Kane sternly warned the two of them not to try to leave the school. The matter about Floyd needed to wait for the results of the investigation by the Ministry of Magic. Although Maureen knew the truth of the matter, he was powerless. Because of his special ability, he can see through the disguises of the old witch and Lucas, but other Aurors can't do it. They haven't found out the truth yet. Floyd's blood curse is very powerful, even a dozen Aurors can't break it. In order to get the black cube in his hand, the old witch and Lucas used the Aurors and framed all the crimes on Floyd. Now Floyd has been arrested, and two Aurors died at the scene. The situation is not optimistic. Chapter 442, Powerless. Only 2 days had passed, and the attack on Peter's town had spread like wildfire in the wizarding world. Although the destroyed town had been restored to normal by the Aurors and the memories of the Muggles in the town had been adjusted, 11 Muggles and 2 Aurors still died in the incident. The Aurors explained to the Muggles that it was an explosion of the universal natural gas pipeline, but gave a different explanation to all the wizards. On Sunday morning, Hugo gave Maureen a copy of the Daily Prophet, which had a striking headline written in clear large letters: "The notorious dark wizard Lucas was arrested, 2 Aurors died, and 11 Muggles lost their lives." Maureen carefully read the report in the Daily Prophet. The article mentioned that 2 Aurors from the Ministry of Magic sacrificed their lives to capture Lucas, and also mentioned that 11 innocent Muggles died for this. Lucas once broke into the Ministry of Magic, stole dark magic items, and caused riots in various places. This time, he was desperate in the town where he lived, and cast dark magic to torture the Muggles in the town with nightmares. 11 Muggles died in nightmares. We are very sad about this. The suspect's real name is not Lucas, but Spencer Floyd. He disguised himself as Lucas and committed crimes everywhere. We have enough evidence to show that the real Lucas is dead, and the previous riots were caused by Floyd. Captain Nicole of the Auror Squad accepted an interview with our reporter. He said that the most dangerous suspect in the wizarding world recently has been arrested, and everyone no longer needs to worry about the panic caused by this dark wizard. Nicole is an effective Auror. He mainly uses swift and resolute means to catch criminals. Under the leadership of Auror Nicole, 13 Aurors joined forces to capture Lucas, but 2 Aurors still lost their lives. Freud is a very powerful brain blocker. Legilimency is ineffective against him, but according to Nicole, Freud's identity is far more than that. He is investigating and collecting evidence. This wizard, whose real name is Freud, is very likely related to a case more than 10 years ago. This time Nicole caught Lucas. This newspaper learned from the Ministry of Magic that Nicole will be rewarded for solving the Lucas case and will even take this opportunity to be promoted to Deputy Director of the Auror Department. Promoted to Deputy Director of the Auror Department. Maureen looked at the Daily Prophet with a deep frown. The group of Aurors in the Ministry of Magic had indeed determined that Freud was Lucas. Even the investigation process had been omitted, and Freud did not give Freud a chance to refute. It must be said that Lucas and the old witch played this hand very cleverly, diverting the attention of the Ministry of Magic at once. Now that the Ministry of Magic has caught Lucas, the two of them can carry out the next plan more blatantly. Maureen took the newspaper to the library to find Sweet. He knew that Sweet usually hid in the corner of the library to read books. Sweet was in a more depressed mood recently. He almost didn't speak, even in the dormitory. He returned to the way he ignored people at the beginning of the school year. When Maureen found Sweet in the corner of the library, he found that there was a thick pile of black leather magic books on Sweet's desk. The names of these Ministry of Magic looked very boring. Basic Muggle protection regulations and basic laws of wizards? Maureen looked at the book next to Sweet in surprise. Such boring books are usually only encountered by senior students in some elective courses when they want to work in the Ministry of Magic. I didn't expect Sweet to read such books at this time. Sweet glanced at Maureen, then lowered his head and continued to read his book. Do you want to read a law book to defend your father? Maureen asked as he sat down. He's not my father. Sweet said sullenly. Then what are you doing? Maureen asked. Sweet was silent for a long time before he said, I won't forgive him, but, he turned a page of the book and continued with a dim look, but I don't want him to be like me, without a father since childhood. Sorry. Maureen didn't know what to answer. The more he interacted with Sweet, the more he found that Sweet was a very special person. He was taciturn and indifferent to other people, but he always had his own scale in his heart when doing things. Maybe he felt that the process of growing up alone was not comfortable, and he didn't want Nim to be like him. Floyd didn't grow up with him, and he hated this person, but he didn't hate his half-brother. He knew who he should blame in his heart and who was innocent. Maureen knew that even if Sweet read all the wizarding laws, it would be useless. He was just a second-year student with no power, no influence, and no background. It was impossible for him to go to the Ministry of Magic to change anything. But Maureen also knew that Sweet just wanted to find something to do and get familiar with wizard law. It's not possible now, but maybe after graduation in the future? This is the only thing he can do. Maureen handed the newspaper to Sweet, who read it silently, with anger flashing in his eyes. The latest novels are first published on 69 Shuba. Is the Ministry of Magic such a group of people? Don't they follow the law? Just accuse him of such a crime. Sweet asked angrily. The incident is so serious, and 2 Aurors have died. They must do something, find someone to take over, and calm the storm first. Maureen still has some understanding of the work style of the Ministry of Magic staff. Alton often complains that the legal provisions of the Ministry of Magic are just empty words, and Maureen knows more about it. Sweet clenched the pen in his hand and took a deep breath. In fact, the most important thing is to find Lucas and the old witch. As long as they are caught, your father will be proven innocent, Maureen said. The two fell silent. They both knew that it was very difficult to catch Lucas and the old witch. They had too many tricks. They could block the detection of the Ministry of Magic and take risks to blend into the Aurors to frame others. Who knows what they will do next? They have already stolen the Black Cube, right? Sweet asked. The Black Cube is hidden in that house. They broke into that house that day and did steal the Black Cube. Maureen nodded. There was no doubt about this, because Maureen had already gone to the stone arch in front of Hogwarts Castle to see it. The 10th pattern of the stone arch had just appeared, but it was deeply embedded in the stone arch at this time, which meant that 10 black cubes had been found by Lucas and the old witch. Maureen has told this to Principal McGonagall, who believes Maureen's statement for the time being. However, because everyone knows too little about the Black Cube, they cannot be sure what will happen after the Black Cube opens the stone archway. Professor Binns is still missing, and he has not returned yet. The only thing Maureen can be sure of is that the Black Cube guarded by the Cuthbert family has not been found. The last Black Cube belongs to the Ambrosius family and is in the hands of Arnok in the painting. Chapter 443 Nicole. For a week, Maureen would go to the stone archway of Hogwarts Castle every day to check. Only when he was sure that the 11th pattern did not appear on the stone archway would he feel relieved. Headmaster McGonagall now allowed him to approach the stone archway. Although there were still many questions, she basically believed what Maureen said, which made Maureen feel relieved. Headmaster McGonagall was also trying to find the whereabouts of Professor Binns. Unfortunately, after searching for so long, she still couldn't find any trace of Professor Binns. Professor Binns disappeared, and Headmaster McGonagall didn't find another suitable professor immediately, so Professor Adams temporarily taught the history of magic. Professor Adams was more than qualified to teach the history of magic course. Although he couldn't cast a decent magic, it was undeniable that he was very good in courses that didn't require magic. But sometimes Professor Adams' class would conflict with a Muggle studies class, so at this time Professor Flitwick or Professor Francis would take turns to replace him. Students who were used to ghosts teaching suddenly had a living professor to teach. Many students were not used to it, especially when it was Professor Francis' turn to teach. The feeling was even more terrifying. Professor Francis's classes were often linked to death. He turned the boring history of magic into a terrifying history of death. In every class, he would ask how a famous wizard in the history of magic died, what the details of the death were, and what kind of magic killed the wizards and what kind of fate they would have, such as missing arms and legs or something, internal organs turned outward, eyeballs bulging out, etc. So no one dozed off in the history of magic anymore. On Friday afternoon, after Professor Francis finished teaching Maureen and the others about the history of magic, he packed up and left the classroom. Maureen had no classes in the last 2 periods, and he was going to Quidditch training. When he was walking along the corridor to the dormitory to get his broom, he suddenly heard someone arguing at the corner. Maureen vaguely heard that the voice seemed to come from Professor Francis, and it also mentioned something like Goodwin, Scarlet Blood Hand. He hesitated for a moment and stopped at the corner. Then he heard who the other person was, or Nicole, who had spoken to them in the town that day. Francis, you should understand that this matter is of great importance. From the standpoint of the Ministry of Magic, you should also help me, Nicole said. I have already said that I don't know who Goodwin and Scarlet Bloodhand are. This person did not show up at the beginning. Professor Francis' tone seemed a little impatient. Nicole said anxiously, don't joke, Francis. You were the one investigating the Scarlet Hand case 11 years ago. You must be very familiar with this person. So what? It's been 11 years. I'm not an Auror now, and I haven't been involved in this case for a long time. I just need you to help me confirm, Francis, whether Floyd is the Scarlet Hand. You have been investigating this person before, and you must be aware of some of the characteristics of the Scarlet Hand. If Floyd is really the Scarlet Hand, then he will be charged with another crime, and the case from more than 10 years ago will be solved. Charge one more crime. Professor Francis sneered. Nicole, before you convicted Floyd, did you investigate the magical traces at the crime scene as I suggested? There were so many suspicious points at the scene, and you directly concluded that he was Lucas. Nicole was choked and said angrily, Floyd is Lucas. Francis, there is absolutely no mistake about this. Hanson and Richard died in his hands, and those muggles also died because of his dark magic. If he was not guilty, why did he resist the pursuit of our Aurors? Then have you ever thought that there are two real criminals mixed in the Auror team you lead? Francis, watch the way you speak. There is no way that there are any strangers mixed in with our Aurors. If you are doubting Hanson and Richard, I warn you, they died in the line of duty. You will be responsible for insulting them, Nicole said angrily. Use your brain, Nicole. You always take things for granted, and you still haven't changed this habit after so many years. Professor Francis said sarcastically, if Floyd had his own wife and children in the town, would he risk casting dark magic on all the muggles to deliberately attract you Aurors, and then sit and wait for you to come? Is this a low-level mistake a cunning criminal would make? I don't care what the criminal is thinking, Francis. Maybe he wants to provoke us, or maybe he feels that he has no way to escape. No way to escape? Nicole, don't you think it's ridiculous? Professor Francis said, you know best how powerful that man's magic is. If he wasn't trying to protect his wife and children, how could you catch him with just a few of you? Are you questioning our ability? Nicole said angrily, he's just a criminal who uses dark magic items. You overestimate him too much? I know the level of the Aurors you brought, Nicole. Believe me, my vision is no worse than yours in this regard. Professor Francis said bluntly, the Aurors present that they were not very experienced, but they had bad tempers. They were my students a few years ago. I am really ashamed of them. How dare you say that about the Aurors of our Ministry of Magic, you? Nicole was already irritated. He seemed to want to say something harsh, but Professor Francis just sneered, and Nicole swallowed his harsh words. The latest novels are first published on the 69th book bar. As a professor at Hogwarts, you should cooperate with our investigation. This is your duty. You are no longer an Auror and have no right to threaten me. According to the relevant laws of the wizarding world, you know best how ridiculous the laws of the wizarding world are. Professor Francis said coldly, the laws of the wizarding world only apply to powerless wizards. For wizards with power and background, the law is just a useless word. Otherwise, how could Floyd be convicted so easily by you? Nicole said angrily, you dare to question the laws of the Ministry of Magic. If the laws of the wizarding world are really that effective, you should make good use of it and give Floyd a chance to defend himself, instead of sending him to Azkaban impatiently and not even giving him a chance to appeal. Professor Francis was very tough and did not show any courtesy just because Nicole was an Auror. Very good, I remember, Francis, since you don't cooperate with me to investigate the matter of the Scarlet Bloodhound. A piece of advice, Nicole, the principle of Auror's attendance is based on the safety of human life. Professor Francis said coldly, if you Aurors could send one person to help the Muggles remove the dark magic that day, 11 Muggles would not have died. You are becoming more and more extreme in your actions. You don't have to care about what I do. Don't let me catch you, Francis. Nicole turned and left angrily. Maureen quickly pretended to squat down to tie his shoelaces, and he didn't stand up until Nicole walked over. Chapter 444 Old Things. This was the first time that Maureen heard about these things. He never knew that Professor Francis was investigating the matter of Scarlet Hand and Goodwin when he was still an Auror more than 10 years ago. But Maureen had no idea what Goodwin had done wrong. Nicole seemed to come to Professor Francis just to confirm whether Floyd was the Scarlet Hand. Nicole alone didn't even have the chance to get Floyd to speak. Did you hear everything? Professor Francis came from the corner and looked at Maureen coldly. Sorry, I didn't mean it. Maureen spread his hands. He still felt very uncomfortable when facing Professor Francis, but he still asked with courage, Professor, what did Scarlet Hand do wrong? Professor Francis stared at Maureen for a while with an expressionless face, and said, this has nothing to do with you. Professor, Sweet is very depressed, I think it is necessary to help him. Maureen said. You have no say in this matter. Professor Francis said coldly, stay in school and don't think about playing the role of a detective all day long. Professor Francis turned around and walked towards the stairs. His steps were very hurried. The students passing by avoided him and dared not block his way. He disappeared at the end of the corridor as if he was avoiding the plague. Maureen looked at the place where Professor Francis left, and was quite puzzled. Professor Francis was originally an Auror, and he was far from retirement age. According to Nicole's statement that day, he should be a very capable Auror who could scare criminals. Why would he choose to be a professor at Hogwarts? Could it be that his coming to Hogwarts as a professor has something to do with Goodwin? Maureen remembered that when he talked to Floyd alone, he asked Floyd why he didn't come to Hogwarts to find Sweet. Floyd said that he couldn't go to Hogwarts. Was it because of Professor Francis? He thought for a moment, then ran quickly to the dormitory. It was impossible for Maureen not to investigate the matter. No matter what, he felt it was necessary to help Sweet. Maureen wrote a letter in the dormitory. Professor Francis did not tell him, but Maureen still had Alton. He told Alton about Sweet's situation and asked his grandfather about the ins and outs of the Scarlet Blood Hand. More than a decade ago, Maureen was still very young, but Alton had worked in the Ministry of Magic, so he should know about it. But Alton's reply to him was only a few simple words. Don't worry about it, study hard, and don't worry. Does Grandpa know something about it? Maureen looked at Alton's reply, and his heart became more and more confused. At the end of April, Gryffindor played against Slytherin. For Pork, this was a crucial game, because this game was related to whether Gryffindor had a chance to win the championship this year. Currently, Ravenclaw ranks first in total points. Although Gryffindor lost to Ravenclaw last time, because each team won different points, Gryffindor's points still ranked second after one round of points. In this game, Maureen will act as the Seeker. We can only tie with Ravenclaw in total points if we win 300 points over Slytherin, so that we have a chance to play another game with Ravenclaw. If we lose or do not win 300 points, Ravenclaw will directly become the champion. Poker looked at all the players with a heavy face. This is the last game of the Quidditch regular season this semester. The two teams of Slytherin and Hufflepuff have already been eliminated from the Quidditch Cup this year. Ravenclaw is currently leading by a large score, which is equivalent to the championship being predetermined. If Gryffindor wants to win the championship, it must first be 150 points ahead of Slytherin, and then Maureen will catch the golden snitch. But it is too difficult to lead Slytherin by 150 points, especially when there is a very poor Sweet in the team. If we win 310 points over Slytherin, we will be the champions this year, right? James asked from the side. Yes, Pork sighed. He knew it was really difficult without thinking. He continued, this is my last Quidditch game at school this year. It is very important to me. Pork is already in the 7th grade and will graduate after this year. This year, Pork has been very strict with other team members for this reason. He glanced at Sweet, who was curled up in the corner. Sweet and Maureen had always been the core of the team, but after these few games, Sweet was in such a bad state that he dragged down the whole team. But Maureen had already explained it to everyone. He simply said that Sweet's family had suffered a change, so he became listless. Maureen did not explain the specific situation in detail. He just didn't want Pork and the others to blame Sweet. Pork was more accommodating to this kind of thing. After he understood the situation, he didn't say anything to Sweet. He just let Sweet be alone and didn't intend to let Sweet play. But Sweet suddenly raised his head, his eyes revealed a strange breath. That cold and indifferent look has reappeared on him. I want to play, Poke. Everyone looked at Sweet, even Maureen was surprised. Sweet, this is not a joke, you have personal problems, I don't blame you, but during the game, if you can't adjust your state, I think, Poke has tried his best to speak very tactfully. He didn't know what happened in Sweet's family, but seeing Sweet's decadent state in recent training, he didn't have the heart to criticize. The latest novels are first published on the 69th book bar. I'm fine. Sweet pursed his lips, the first 2 games were my fault, I will make up for it. He picked up the broom, his attitude was surprisingly firm. Poke was slightly stunned, he was still thinking, because this game is crucial, so he must make a careful choice. Maureen looked at Sweet and suddenly found that Sweet seemed to be a little different. Poke, give him a chance. Maureen said. Poke hesitated for a moment, and finally nodded and agreed, okay, if you think it's okay, you can replace Diana. I hope everyone can cheer up. Madam Hooch had already blown the assembly whistle outside, and Hugo's commentary echoed throughout the Quidditch field. Everyone picked up their own flying brooms and stood at the door. Maureen and Sweet stood at the back. Have you figured it out? Maureen asked. I will take my own responsibilities. Sweet said in a low voice, whether for myself or Nim, I can't escape. Sweet jumped on the flying broom and rushed out. Chapter 445 Uninvited Guests in the Competition. No one expected that the decadent Sweet, who had been in a bad mood, would suddenly become a different person in this game. He was like a fair spat on the court, shuttling through the crowd and passing through Slytherin's defense at an incredible speed. In just 10 minutes, he scored 5 goals in a row. Sweet's performance was so terrible that even the Gryffindor players were surprised. Even in the past, Sweet was not like this today. "Pork, is he stimulated?" James said cautiously. Poker also seemed a little doubtful, but more surprised. He shouted, "No matter what, let go and charge." With such a brave Sweet, all Gryffindors seemed to see hope, even though their road to winning the championship was very difficult, including catching the Golden Snitch, and they had to lead Slytherin by 300 points in total. Maureen flew through the crowd. He basically didn't help in this game because Sweet was enough. He only needed to hold back the Slytherin Seeker and prevent him from catching the Snitch. Although Slytherin had no hope of winning the championship this year, they didn't want to be at the bottom, so they played very hard in this game. But even the tall and strong Slytherin players seemed unable to stop Sweet. Half an hour later, Gryffindor was far ahead with 160 to 30. Just 2 more goals. Maureen had been following the Slytherin Seeker. He would not attack the Snitch before he was ahead by 150 points, otherwise he would not be able to win the championship even if he won the game. Just now, he had seen the Snitch flash near his own goal, and the Slytherin Seeker also noticed it, but Maureen knocked him away at once, and when the other side stabilized his body, the Snitch had disappeared. Maureen tried to fly as high as possible, and at the same time, he kept hovering over the Slytherin Seeker, so that he could have the widest view and catch up with him in time. He had already flown very high, and from this position he could see the entire Hogwarts castle, even people from the Ministry of Magic. Maureen found a large group of people in the sky, at least 20 wizards from the Ministry of Magic, accompanied by Principal McGonagall and Professor Francis, and went to the stone arch in front of Hogwarts Castle. These wizards surrounded the stone arch, and many of them even took out their wands to cast various magic on the stone arch. Why did so many people suddenly come to the Ministry of Magic? Maureen was very confused. When the stone arch of Hogwarts first appeared last semester, the Ministry of Magic sent people to check, but they didn't find any results. So why did they mobilize so many troops this time? Maureen was also familiar with the person in the lead. It was Augustine, the Minister of Magic. Maureen had met him last summer vacation. Augustine was talking seriously to McGonagall. Maureen could vaguely see that Auror Nicole was also inside. He was talking to Professor Francis. Professor Francis just stood there with his arms folded across his chest, looking at Nicole coldly with an indifferent expression. Nicole seemed very angry and kept pointing at Professor Francis. His finger was even about to poke Professor Francis' face, but was slapped away by Professor Francis. Maureen felt that something was not right. He had gone to the stone arch to check before participating in the competition in the morning. There were no additional patterns on the stone arch, which meant that the other 2 Rubik's Cubes were intact. But why did so many staff members from the Ministry of Magic suddenly come? Most importantly, why did even the Minister of Magic come this time? "What are you doing?" Sweet passed under Maureen in a low voice. In order to avoid being intercepted by the 2 Slytherin players, he passed the quaffle to Maureen. "Sorry, I was distracted." Maureen finally reacted and flicked the quaffle with the tail of his broom, which cleverly bypassed the 2 Slytherin members and returned to Sweet. Sweet had already reached the opponent's goal and threw the ball into the goal again. Maureen looked at the situation at the stone arch again. Principal McGonagall and Professor Francis had already walked aside, leaving the group of Ministry of Magic staff to explore the stone arch. 270 to 100 points. Gryffindor is already 170 points ahead. Incredible. Sweet's performance throughout the game was extremely eye-catching. At this time, as long as Gryffindor's Seeker catches the Golden Snitch, they will be able to win this year's Quidditch Championship Cup. But, wait, is that the Golden Snitch? Hugo's commentary reminded Maureen, and Maureen quickly turned his attention back. He looked around and soon saw the Golden Snitch not far to his left, and the Slytherin Seeker had already rushed in front of him. Maureen also immediately turned his flying broom and rushed forward. Slytherin's captain, Geoffrey, rushed towards him, trying to stop him, but Sweet had already thrown the quaffle in his hand, hitting Geoffrey on the head. Maureen took the opportunity to step over the opponent, knocked away Slytherin's Seeker, and caught the Golden Snitch in his hand. 420 points to 100. Gryffindor created an incredible reversal in the last game, defeating Slytherin by a large margin. Sweet, as the best pitcher of the whole game, scored 240 points. This year's championship belongs to Gryffindor. Sweet is probably enough to be elected as the best pitcher of this game. Hugo announced the final result loudly, and all the Gryffindor students cheered loudly. This result was too unexpected. They thought Gryffindor had no hope of winning the championship this year, but they didn't expect to get the trophy again in the end. Sweet also became the focus of the audience, and everyone in Gryffindor was shouting Sweet's name. The latest novel is published on the 69th book bar. Poker hugged Sweet excitedly, but Sweet still had no expression on his face, as if winning the game had nothing to do with him. He also noticed the Ministry of Magic staff who suddenly visited the castle and were frowning. Maureen had taken advantage of everyone's inattention to pass the excited Gryffindor audience and left the field from under the goalpost of the Quidditch field. He had no time to celebrate. For Maureen, winning the Quidditch game was not that important. It was the Ministry of Magic's coming to find the stone arch that made him curious. After he left the Quidditch field, he got off his broom, because flying over so blatantly would make him too obvious, and so many Ministry of Magic staff would definitely find him. Why did the Ministry of Magic come here? What Maureen didn't expect was that Sweet had caught up with him at some point. I thought you were going to celebrate. Maureen turned onto a small uphill path where a row of trees could block her silhouette. There's nothing to celebrate. Sweet said simply. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 446 The Stolen Arch. Under the cover of a row of willow trees and bushes, Maureen and Sweet gradually approached the stone archway. Unfortunately, they could not get too close because there were no trees in front. Although the magic restrictions here were temporarily lifted by Principal McGonagall, Maureen and Sweet were still more than 20 meters away from the stone archway. This decision is not good. Minister. Maureen vaguely heard Principal McGonagall's slightly angry voice. Through the gaps in the leaves, he saw that Principal McGonagall's mouth had been pursed into a line. Based on Maureen's experience of drinking tea with Principal McGonagall several times, he could probably guess how angry Principal McGonagall was at this time. I'm afraid I have to insist on this, Principal. We must find out the origin of this stone archway. Augustine's attitude was also very firm. This is the property of Hogwarts. It does not belong to the Ministry of Magic. You are not qualified to take it away. Professor McGonagall raised her reading glasses, and the wrinkles on her thin face were tightened. Every wrinkle seemed to contain anger. She had made her position clear. There is no information showing that this stone arch belongs to Hogwarts, Principal McGonagall, otherwise why did it only appear this year? Augustine said. There is no information showing that the stone arch does not belong to Hogwarts. Is it just a coincidence that it appears in Hogwarts? Principal McGonagall said coldly. Augustine fiddled with his wizard hat and continued, I hope you can support our work. This matter is of vital importance. We must investigate the matter thoroughly. Professor Francis said sarcastically, you lost the stone arch of the Department of Mysteries, so you plan to forcibly take away the stone arch of Hogwarts? Your reason is a bit ridiculous. Don't tell me that the Department of Mysteries of your Ministry of Magic is a place where anyone can go at will. Francis, watch your attitude when you speak. Augustine put the wizard hat back on his head, looking very unhappy. It's useless to put pressure on us, Minister. What Professor Francis said is true. Headmaster McGonagall said angrily, I heard that someone broke into the Department of Mysteries the year before last. I thought the Ministry of Magic would step up its vigilance, but I didn't expect it to be broken into again and again. Every time, things were stolen. Now even the ancient stone archway has been stolen. Instead of looking for the thieves, you are targeting our Hogwarts property. The stone archway of the Ministry of Magic was stolen. Maureen was extremely surprised to hear this. Only then did he know why the Ministry of Magic had come to Hogwarts with such a large force. It turned out that the stone archway hidden in the Department of Mysteries was stolen. Maureen knew without even thinking about it that it must have been done by Penguin, but Arnold had clearly gone to the Ministry of Magic to warn Augustine last time, so why did Augustine still let the stone archway be stolen by Penguin? The thief who broke into the Ministry of Magic was very cunning. Last time we had strengthened the protection of the stone arch, but we didn't expect that the thief knew the ministry's guarding methods very well. Augustine frowned and said, the Ministry of Magic was broken into again and again, and his reputation as the Minister of Magic has been greatly affected, so he must solve this matter. Augustine continued with some annoyance, we are investigating this matter. Associating the stone arch of Hogwarts with the stone arch of the Department of Mysteries, we plan to borrow the stone arch of Hogwarts to study it. The stone arch appeared last summer, and the people in the Ministry of Magic also knew about it. Borrow? That's not what you said just now. Principal McGonagall's tone was very cold. Even though the other party was the Minister of Magic, she would not give in when it came to the issue of Hogwarts property. I don't want it to be borrowed and lost again. Principal McGonagall said. Are you questioning the ability of our Ministry of Magic? Augustine stood up straight. He was a head taller than Principal McGonagall, and his tone became a little cold. The same thing has happened once, and you want me not to question it? Principal McGonagall did not retreat at all. Her eyes were very sharp, like a dagger, staring directly at Augustine, so that Augustine could not find any words to refute. Augustine calmed down. He was indeed in the wrong in this matter. Then he slowed down his tone a little and said, this time is different. We only need to study this stone arch. If we can find the connection between the two stone arches, maybe we can find the whereabouts of the other stone arch based on this stone arch. Then we can catch the person who stole the stone arch. So who do you think stole the stone arch of the Ministry of Magic this time? Minister, I remember that you caught Lucas, and the so-called Lucas is still in prison. Who else has the ability to steal the stone arch? Professor Francis said coldly beside him. All the staff members of the Ministry of Magic had strange expressions, as if Professor Francis had poked their tails or something. The wizards who were casting detection magic on the stone archway stopped and looked at each other strangely. What? Did I say something wrong? Professor Francis continued, I've already told you that the man you arrested may not be Lucas, but all of you Aurors didn't investigate clearly and directly determined that he was Lucas. Now Lucas has been arrested, and someone else broke into the Ministry of Magic. This time we have to find another suspect, right? Shut up, Francis, you are just a small professor in a school, how dare you talk to us like this? Nicole looked a little exasperated, if you don't cooperate, you won't be a professor anymore. The latest novels are first published on the 6th-9th book bar. It's useless to threaten me, Nicole. I think the Ministry of Magic has no right to ask who will be the professor of Hogwarts. Professor Francis didn't care about Nicole's anger at all. He looked at Nicole with his usual death eyes, whether I become a professor or not, only the principal has the final say. What does it have to do with you? You? Nicole was extremely angry. But he couldn't do anything, because what Professor Francis said was the truth. During the reign of Voldemort, the professors of Hogwarts were interfered by the Ministry of Magic, which caused Hogwarts to be in a mess. Later, it was all the conscientious teachers and students of Hogwarts and the members of the Order of the Phoenix who joined forces to fight Voldemort and save the wizarding world. Hogwarts had the right to speak because of that incident. In order to prevent Hogwarts from being controlled by dark wizards again and let the same thing happen again, Hogwarts' existence was separated from the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Magic and existed as a separate department, without the interference of those annoying school board departments. Who will be the professor is up to the principal, and the Ministry of Magic can't send its own people to Hogwarts. As for the position of the headmaster, it is elected by all wizards, just like the Minister of Magic, who runs for election based on his ability. Headmaster McGonagall deserves to be the headmaster and has been in office until today. Only when someone at Hogwarts breaks the relevant laws can the Ministry of Magic intervene. At other times, it only needs to cooperate with the Ministry of Magic when necessary. Even Augustine has no right to dismiss any professor at will, let alone the headmaster's affairs. Augustine was silent for a moment, and slowly said, Francis, haven't you heard about it yet? Chapter 447 Prison Break. What did you hear? Lucas escaped from prison. Augustine said slowly. Principal McGonagall, Professor Francis and others all changed their expressions slightly, and Maureen and Sweet, who were not far away, were also shocked. The Lucas mentioned by Augustine and others refers to Floyd, Sweet's father. Less than a month ago, he was just thrown into Azkaban prison by Nicole, but he escaped from Azkaban after being locked up for less than a month? No wonder Nicole was so angry with Professor Francis when she came today. It turned out that the criminal he caught escaped from prison, so his promotion and salary increase would be ruined. It would be strange if he was not angry. Principal McGonagall was also quite surprised and said, "Escape from prison? Do you mean Floyd escaped from Azkaban?" "It's Lucas, Principal McGonagall." Augustine corrected in a very stiff tone, "You heard it right, he escaped from Azkaban." "When did it happen?" Principal McGonagall asked. "It was in the early hours of the day before yesterday." "When was the stone arch lost?" "We haven't confirmed it yet. Not everyone checks the stone arch every day, but it was definitely lost after he escaped from prison, there is no doubt about it," Augustine said very affirmatively. Professor Francis' eyes flickered for a moment, and he said, "Azkaban's guard magic is so strict. You have shackles that curb magic, annoying dementors, and countless magics. I heard that Azkaban now even restricts the abilities of animagus. You actually let a man without a wand escape. You don't need to remind us about the guard problems in Azkaban, Francis," Nicole said angrily. "He must have used dark magic. You should know his identity. You'd better tell us what you know." "I didn't help him escape, Nicole," Professor Francis said impatiently. "Since he escaped, what you should do now is to catch him, not to cause trouble for Hogwarts. If I were you, I would investigate the cells in Azkaban." Nicole stared at Professor Francis, but Professor Francis just crossed his arms indifferently, pretending to ignore Nicole's gaze. "Anyway, Lucas escaped from prison, and the stone arch of the Ministry of Magic was stolen again. We are very sure that the person who stole the stone arch must be Lucas, so as long as we find the whereabouts of the stone arch, we can arrest him." Augustine turned his head and looked at the simple yet heavy stone arch. He had made up his mind to take the stone arch back to the Ministry of Magic for research. Hogwarts professors are not under our jurisdiction, but Hogwarts still needs to assist the Ministry of Magic in handling cases. "I think you are definitely willing to help us catch the fugitive, right?" Augustine stretched out his fingers and fiddled with the buttons on his chest, and said in a playful tone, "Or do the people of Hogwarts not want us to find Lucas?" Principal McGonagall's thin nose twitched slightly. She wanted to refuse, but Augustine had already said so much. If she refused again, Augustine would definitely put a big hat on them. Although Hogwarts is not under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Magic, it has no right to refuse such a thing. After all, the rules are set by the politicians of the Ministry of Magic, but they can also modify them at any time. Principal McGonagall was silent for a moment, and said sternly, "Remember my words, Augustine. I don't care who stole the stone archway of your Ministry of Magic, but this stone archway belongs to Hogwarts. I allow you to study this stone archway, but I hope it will be returned intact after the incident." "Of course." Augustine laughed. "As long as Lucas is executed, the stone archway will naturally be returned." "Execution?" Professor Francis frowned. "We have issued instructions to all the staff of the Ministry of Magic. Lucas broke into the Ministry of Magic again and again. He not only massacred 11 Muggles, but also killed 2 Aurors and escaped from Azkaban. Any staff of the Ministry of Magic who sees Lucas at the first sight must kill him if he resists arrest. This is for the stability of the wizarding world, Francis, you should understand." Augustine said these words very calmly. In his opinion, killing a prisoner who committed heinous crimes is not a tangled matter. Professor Francis snorted coldly and did not respond. But from his expression, he seemed to hate Augustine's decision, but he could not interfere in the affairs of the Ministry of Magic. Sweet, who was beside Maureen, was shocked when he heard the word execution. "How dare they? I have read some laws and regulations. Unless it is absolutely necessary, Aurors have no right to directly kill criminals, and this matter has nothing to do with him at all. Are the Ministry of Magic a group of people who can't distinguish right from wrong?" Sweet said with gritted teeth. "I didn't expect Augustine to make such a decision," Maureen said heavily. He didn't know how Sweet's father escaped from the heavily guarded Azkaban. Maybe it was by the blood curse. After all, that ability was really powerful. Even Payanger coveted it, but the current situation made everything worse. The Ministry of Magic has already used all means to catch Lucas. They will definitely send more people to closely monitor Nim and his son. Once Floyd goes back to see them, he will probably be in danger. The latest novels are first published on 69 Shuba. I need to warn him. Sweet touched the pendant on his neck. "Are you crazy? To warn him?" Maureen shook his head. "This is not a wise choice, and it may even drag him down." Sweet clenched his fists. Maureen turned his attention back to the stone archway. He was very anxious now because he had been relying on the stone archway to determine how many black cubes Piingid had obtained. From what Hufflepuff said, it was known that even the stone archway at Hogwarts was far from simple. If the Ministry of Magic took the stone archway away, it would most likely make things worse. But Principal McGonagall had been forced to agree, and Maureen could not stop it. The Quidditch field was still boiling, and the Gryffindor students were hugging and cheering to celebrate this year's Quidditch champion. But all this had nothing to do with Maureen. He was now thinking only about Piingid. Piingid collected the black cubes in order to use them to open the stone archway. Now that he had obtained 10 keys and successfully stolen the stone archway from the Ministry of Magic, he would definitely look for the remaining 2 keys next. Maureen did not know what would happen after the stone archway was opened, but he already felt that the key in Arnok's hand was a little unsafe. Chapter 448 People Who Have No Time to Cheer. When Maureen and Sweet returned to the Gryffindor common room, everyone was still celebrating. Hugo ran over excitedly and shouted, "Where have you been? Our school has won the championship, but you two, the biggest contributors, are not here. We were just injured, we went to the school infirmary." Maureen evaded. Many students came up to surround Maureen and Sweet, especially Sweet, who was usually unknown. Today's performance was so outstanding that everyone remembered this serious man. But Sweet still had a cold face. His father escaped from Azkaban for some reason, and now the Ministry of Magic planned to kill his father. Even if Sweet was unwilling to forgive his father, he was unwilling to watch him being killed. These things were all in his mind, and the result of the game was not important to him at all. Celebrate our Jedi counterattack and reversal of the game. Enjoy it to your heart's content. James and Albus shouted and scattered a lot of candies in the common room, and cast magic on these candies. The openings of the candies were like wings, flapping constantly, flying around the entire common room. Everyone was jumping around noisily to catch these restless candies. Even Doi was jumping happily. It stepped on everyone's heads to catch the candies that were cast with magic. The people who were stepped on could not see it, nor did they care about its existence. They would only occasionally find that the candies they had just put into their pockets seemed to have been stolen by someone. Doi nimbly grabbed a handful of candies, then jumped back to Maureen and stuffed the candies into Maureen's pockets. Seeing Hugo holding a pile of candies in his arms, it took advantage of Hugo's carelessness to secretly take the candies from Hugo's arms and stuff them into Maureen's pockets. Its little eyes were full of happiness. Maureen and Sweet squeezed through the crowd, returned to their dormitory, and put the flying broom back. "We have to do something," Sweet said solemnly while sitting on his bed. "Unless we can find out where Professor Binns is, he is now guarding the last black cube there," Maureen said. "Doi, it's great." Doi heartlessly peeled a candy and threw the candy wrapper under the bed. Its mouth was full of candy. "I don't understand why Professor Binns didn't let the principal know. He could have asked the principal to help protect the black cube," Sweet said. Maureen pondered for a moment and said, "Maybe he doesn't want to take the risk. Basically, no one has heard of the black cube and doesn't understand what it means. Or maybe Professor Binns doesn't trust the professors in the school," Sweet asked. "It's possible. Maybe after Professor Binns learned that Piingid broke into Hogwarts last year, he thought that Hogwarts was not an ideal place to hide the black cube. He didn't tell the professor about it in order to prevent Piingid from taking advantage of it." Maureen only had this guess at the moment. Professor Binns probably knew the significance of the black cube very well. Letting more people know about the black cube would only bring danger to the black cube, so he chose not to say it. "But how can a ghost like him protect the black cube?" Sweet said. Maureen shook his head. He had no answer to that. They all knew that ghosts could not perform magic. They might be able to blow air to scare muggles, but they could not harm people, let alone protect the black cube. When the two of them were thinking in the dormitory, the door was suddenly pushed open. Hugo ran in with a bunch of candies. He threw all the candies on his bed and said excitedly, "Why are you two here? By the way, Professor Kane wants to see you two. He is waiting outside. Maybe he wants to give you a warm hug or something." Maureen and Sweet looked at each other. They probably knew why Professor Kane wanted to see them. "Okay." Maureen changed his Quidditch clothes, then stood up and walked out of the dormitory. Doi had already jumped onto Hugo's bed and secretly took away a bunch of candies from Hugo. Then he caught up with Maureen and stuffed all the candies into Maureen's pockets. Hugo had no idea about this. Maureen and Sweet squeezed through the noisy common room. Professor Kane was waiting for them in the corridor. Very good, you two, I heard about it, you did a great job, this year's championship cup is ours again. Professor Kane smiled, patted Maureen and Sweet on the shoulders, praised them first, and then said, but I came to you today not for this matter, although it is a bit abrupt. Professor, is it because of the stone arch? Maureen asked. You already know it. Professor Kane was surprised. There are so many people from the Ministry of Magic gathered in front of the stone arch, it's hard not to know. Maureen said. Professor Kane nodded slightly, and then said hesitantly, this matter is very troublesome. They intend to take away the stone arch. The method is too rough, but there is no way. We have no reason to refuse their request. Anyway, Principal McGonagall asked you two to go over. Maureen and Sweet followed Professor Kane silently and walked up the stairs to the third floor. The principal's office on the third floor was no longer unfamiliar to Maureen. He seemed to have become a frequent visitor here. He would come here from time to time and was familiar with it. The latest novel is first published on the 69th book bar. The three of them stopped in front of an ugly stone beast. Professor Kane knocked on the stone beast and said the command, be strict with yourself. The huge stone beast slowly flapped its wings and spun around, revealing a gap. The three of them walked into the spiral staircase together. The staircase began to move up and soon stopped in front of the principal's office. Professor Kane knocked on the door, and it was soon opened. It was Professor Francis who opened the door. There seemed to be someone inside who was talking loudly. Maureen could tell that it was Augustine's voice. Principal McGonagall was negotiating something with him. Wait a minute before going in. Professor Francis walked out and closed the door. Why are they still here? I thought they should go to study the stone archway. Professor Kane asked dissatisfiedly. He also had some complaints about the people in the Ministry of Magic. They hoped that the headmaster can provide more information about the stone archway, and now they are planning to go even further and take away all the books in the headmaster's library. They believe that the secret of the stone archway must be recorded in the books in the headmaster's library. Professor Francis snorted coldly. Did the headmaster agree? Professor Kane asked. Professor Francis shook his head. That is the secret of Hogwarts. Only the headmaster recognized by Hogwarts is qualified to agree. Others are not allowed to read it. The Ministry of Magic does not have this right. Professor Kane asked angrily, then what dirty means are they using to force the headmaster now? It's really getting more and more shameless. Chapter 449. A frequent visitor to the principal's office. It's not the first time they've tried to do this. When Hogwarts was controlled by Umbridge for more than 20 years, she also wanted to get the secret of the headmaster's library, but the castle refused her entry. But don't worry, as long as the headmaster disagrees, Augustine can't do anything. Professor Francis said. I'm afraid they will put some big hat on our school later. It's really crazy. They don't do their own job well, but always want to take over Hogwarts. Professor Kane leaned against the door, annoyed. Professor Francis glanced at Maureen and Sweet, and asked coldly without emotion, do you know the whole thing? I know it roughly. Professor Kane just briefly explained it. Maureen nodded. After a moment, he asked again, Professor, did the headmaster ask us to tell the Ministry of Magic about the secret of the stone arch? No. Professor Francis said, on the contrary, we need you two to keep it secret. Keep it secret. Maureen was a little surprised. He thought the purpose of this trip was to assist the Ministry of Magic in handling the case. Yes, keep it secret. Professor Francis nodded. The Ministry of Magic is just messing around now. The headmaster will not allow Hogwarts to have the same thing happen more than 20 years ago. The most important thing is that we choose to believe you. Professor Francis looked at Maureen, his eyes still staring at death. Originally, what Professor Francis said should have moved him, but under this kind of gaze, Maureen really couldn't be moved. Oh, thank you. Maureen didn't know how to answer, so he just had to be polite. Professor Kane said, the Ministry of Magic doesn't believe what we say, so we can only do it our own way. So far, everything you said is basically correct, so this should belong to Hogwarts. Letting the Ministry of Magic intervene will only make things a mess. After all, Professor Kane said here and didn't say anything else, but Professor Francis interrupted and said, they are just a group of self-righteous politicians. Professor Francis continued bluntly, they will only wipe out everything that is not good for their reputation. In short, no matter who it is for, the Ministry of Magic doesn't know about your relationship with Floyd, Sweet, so you two know what to do. Sweet nodded silently. After he gave up on the Ministry of Magic, at least there were professors in the school standing by him, which made him feel better. Soon the door of the principal's office was opened, and Principal McGonagall walked out with a stern face. Augustine also looked unhappy. The conversation between the two was not pleasant. "Oh, you are all here, why are there 2 more students?" Augustine forced a smile, his eyes fell on Maureen, and he said in surprise, "I recognize you, Alton's grandson, Bobby Singer's favorite student, right? He is here for detention," Principal McGonagall said coldly. Maureen touched his nose, trying to put on an innocent, ashamed, remorseful, heartbroken and determined to change his ways and be a good student in the future. Detention? What did he do wrong? Why? Now the Ministry of Magic will even control how I educate students, Principal McGonagall said. Augustine's eyes were a little annoyed, but he still smiled. "I'm just asking casually, so Principal McGonagall, I still hope you can consider my suggestion." "I will consider it, Augustine," Principal McGonagall responded, but her tone showed that the possibility of her considering it was probably zero. Augustine stood on the spiral staircase and disappeared below, and Principal McGonagall motioned them to come in. Everything in the headmaster's office is always in good order, even the photos of past headmasters on the ceiling are neatly arranged. Headmaster McGonagall likes to treat everything rigorously. The headmasters on the ceiling all sat up straight and looked at Maureen curiously. Headmaster Dumbledore even raised his half-moon glasses and winked at Maureen, who smiled as well. He still respected Dumbledore in the photo. "What's wrong with this little brat?" An old man wearing a red wizard hat sitting at the table in the photo said. "Is he in trouble again? I have seen him no less than 10 times. He is really a troublemaker. There are not many students who can come to the principal's office frequently." Another bald old man was fiddling with his long brown beard and was braiding a small braid. While braiding, he said seriously, "In fact, I have always suggested that he should be locked up in the cellar. He will be obedient in the dark for a week. There is no cellar in Hogwarts, Binus. Your school philosophy is outdated." An old witch next to her was drinking a green drink with a smile. The drink was still bubbling, like a ball of mud. "It's easy to get a cellar. Isn't it just a matter of waving a wand?" Another wizard with small eyes stared at Maureen with ill intentions. "I agree with confinement in the cellar. First confiscate his wand, and then throw him into the cellar. It's better to put some rotten eggs in it, so that he won't dare to cause trouble next time. Or put rotten eggs. The feces of the hookworm smells the worst, but considering this, dragon power spray is also good, it can make him doubt his life. The latest novels are first published in the 6th 9-book bar. Hey. Are you still the respected principals of Hogwarts? Where is the trust between people? Why do you always think of such inhumane punishment methods?" Maureen secretly criticized the principals who came up with bad ideas in these photos. Can't they pay attention to their image? Put him in solitary confinement, but putting rotten eggs, bugs and feces in there is really too much? The walls of the principal's office are hung with photos of past principals. In the past, no one who came to the principal's office could escape their eyes. Maureen was basically a frequent visitor, and all the principals knew him. When they saw him at this time, they all enthusiastically suggested to Principal McGonagall how to punish this restless student. Maureen touched his nose with an innocent look. "You guys sit down first." Principal McGonagall ignored the talking principals. She took out her wand, waved a few chairs, and landed them in the room. She herself sat on the high-backed chair behind the desk. "Professor Kane and Professor Francis must have explained the matter to you. I won't say more. Maureen, what else do you know? Tell us everything and we will find a way to solve it together." "Professor, I don't know much more than you. I have said everything I should say. Now the most urgent thing is to find Professor Binns. He must know where one of the black cubes is," Maureen said. "We can't find where Professor Binns' descendants are. He never mentioned these things to us." Principal McGonagall put the pen in front of her desk straight and said very seriously, "What about Helena? That is Ms. Gray. She left the school and must have gone to find the black cube. You should know where her home is, right?" Maureen asked. "Helena is still missing. It stands to reason that Payengid has already got a black cube of their family, so Helena should have returned." Chapter 450, Principal McGonagall's Attitude. "We still haven't received any news about Helena, and we have visited the place where she used to live, but, as far as we know, the descendants of Ravenclaw have long been untraceable," Headmaster McGonagall said. She raised her reading glasses, then turned her eyes to Sweet, and said, "Because of Maureen, although he often gets into trouble, we choose to believe him this time. We also believe that your father Clive is innocent. Considering that Clive is on the run, he will either contact Nim and his mother, or very likely contact you." Sweet lowered his head, his mouth moved slightly, and didn't say much. The Ministry of Magic doesn't know his true identity yet. He hides his secrets very well, in fact, even we don't know. If it weren't for Maureen telling us about your relationship with him, we wouldn't know that his real name is Goodwin Floyd Clive. Headmaster McGonagall paused meaningfully here, and Professor Francis stretched out his fingers and tapped the armrest of the chair lightly, his eyelids drooping, as if thinking about something. "We didn't tell the Ministry of Magic about your relationship with him, for the sake of your privacy. But, Sweet, you have to give us a promise. If your father contacts you, you must let us know at the first time," Principal McGonagall said seriously. Sweet was silent for a moment, shook his head and said, "He won't contact me. Whether it will or not, if you don't want your father to be killed by the horrors of the Ministry of Magic, we have to consider every possibility. This is the greatest help we can give you," Principal McGonagall emphasized. "If he comes to me, I tell you, how will you treat him?" Sweet asked. Principal McGonagall exchanged glances with Professor Francis and Professor Kane, and then said, "All we want to know is the matter of the Black Cube, and by the way, sort out some things in the past." "Things in the past?" Sweet frowned. "What things in the past?" "He used to go to Hogwarts." "Believe me, Sweet, we can talk about many things in the past," Principal McGonagall said simply. This answer did not satisfy Sweet, but Sweet understood that compared to those Ministry of Magic staff who wanted to kill his father for their reputation, the professors of the school were the only people he could trust. Merlin looked at Principal McGonagall, who was sitting upright, and then at Professor Francis, who was sitting there expressionless, and then glanced at Professor Kane, who was holding a teacup. He didn't know why he always felt that something was wrong. Principal McGonagall's attitude was beyond Merlin's expectations. Although Merlin knew that the professors at Hogwarts were all very good, he still felt that there was some special meaning hidden in Principal McGonagall's words. Was it because of the name Goodwin? But Merlin thought about it and finally didn't say it. He chose to hold up the teacup like Professor Kane and took a sip of tea. "I have to admit that the tea in the principal's office is still very good. This kind of high-quality wizard tea can't be drunk anywhere else. This kind of tea will keep rotating, sometimes clockwise and sometimes counterclockwise. You still need skills when drinking tea." The first time Maureen drank tea, he jumped up and down like a monkey because of the burn. It was not until his tears came out that Principal McGonagall slowly reminded him that this kind of tea cannot be drunk when it is rotating clockwise. It can only be drunk when the tea is rotating counterclockwise. Then Maureen drank a beautiful feeling of flowers blooming and everything competing for spring. Later, he thought that coming to the principal's office to drink tea was not so bad. Every time he came to the principal's office, in addition to being complained by the board principals of the past generations on the ceiling, drinking tea was his favorite thing to do. But Sweet was obviously not in the mood to touch the teacup. His face was still pale, and his right hand was holding the fang pendant on his chest. I don't know what he was thinking. Maureen knew something about Sweet's inner thoughts. The pendant in Sweet's hand had a very powerful blood curse that could ensure that he would not be found by his father. If Sweet wanted to wait for his father to find him, as Principal McGonagall said, he had to make a choice. Sweet was silent for a moment, and finally took off the fang pendant on his chest. Maureen knew he would make this choice, because Sweet said that he didn't want Nim to grow up like him, without his father's company. That's all I want to say. If you understand what I mean, you can go back and celebrate now, and by the way, congratulations on leading Gryffindor to win this year's Quidditch Cup, Principal McGonagall said. Thank you, Principal. Maureen and Sweet stood up and walked towards the door. When they reached the door, Principal McGonagall said again, in addition, this is an extraordinary period. I don't want to see you two breaking school rules again, especially you, Maureen. You often get into trouble this semester. This is not a joke. I will be honest, Principal. Maureen nodded very sincerely and promised, then opened the door of the principal's office. Principal Binnis, who was braiding his beard, said from behind, Principal McGonagall, as soon as you see his honest appearance, you know he is not honest. Don't you really want to consider my suggestion? Put him in the cellar and put some rotten eggs or something. He will definitely obey. Maureen stumbled. What kind of hatred or grudge is this? Is it really that serious? The two of them left the principal's office and went down the spiral staircase. Before they had walked far, Professor Francis came from behind, caught up with them, and stopped them. I have something else to ask you, Sweet. Professor Francis said indifferently. The latest novels are first published on the 6th book bar. What is it? Sweet asked in a low voice. Professor Francis stared at Maureen with a deadly look that kept people away from him. This look told Maureen that he wanted to talk to Sweet alone. I'm leaving first, let's go back and celebrate. Maureen shrugged his shoulders and left tactfully. He had originally planned to go back to the common room, but thinking of the Gryffindor students celebrating their victory in Quidditch, he was not in the mood to join them, so he decided to go outside the castle to see the stone arch. When he walked outside the castle gate, there were already many students gathered here, most of them were from the other 3 colleges. After watching the game, the Gryffindor students went back to celebrate, while they were watching and guessing what the people from the Ministry of Magic were doing. The staff of the Ministry of Magic were using magic to cut the terrain around the stone arch. They had already dug out the foundation of the stone arch, and 7 or 8 Aurors were carefully using the levitation spell to suspend the stone arch in the air. Some Aurors jumped into the pit dug under the stone arch and used various detectors to check the magic below, wanting to know why the stone arch suddenly appeared. Are they going to dig up the clues to the treasure? That's too much. We haven't found the treasure left by the 4 founders yet. The Ministry of Magic people are openly robbing our school's things. Many students were filled with righteous indignation and expressed dissatisfaction with the Ministry of Magic's behavior. Maureen kept looking at the stone archway and fell into deep thought. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.